Picture this. You're standing in the ruins of an ancient Indian palace, the monsoon winds carrying whispers of a civilization that once held secrets so profound they could rewrite everything we know about genetics, medicine, and human potential. The year is 320 CE, and the Gupta Empire is rising like a golden phoenix across the Indian subcontinent. But this isn't just another story about kings and conquests. This is about something far more extraordinary, something that challenges the very foundation of what we believe about ancient science. What I'm about to reveal to you will sound impossible. It will make you question your textbooks, your professors, and maybe even your understanding of human history itself. Because deep within the archives of the Gupta Empire, hidden beneath layers of Sanskrit manuscripts and encrypted in symbols that scholars dismissed as mere mythology, lies evidence of genetic research that predates modern science by over 1,500 years. I'm talking about laboratories. Real laboratories, with documented procedures for selective breeding that went beyond anything we thought ancient civilizations could achieve. I'm talking about detailed records of what can only be described as early genetic manipulation, preservation techniques that our ancestors supposedly couldn't have known, and therapeutic practices that seem to mirror cutting-edge biotechnology. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another conspiracy theory, let me tell you why this matters to you. The techniques I'm about to show you, the knowledge that was buried for centuries, could revolutionize how we approach medicine, agriculture, and human enhancement today. The Gupta scientists weren't just playing around with herbs and meditation. They were conducting systematic research that makes our modern genetic labs look primitive by comparison. And here's the kicker. Everything I'm about to reveal comes from primary sources. Sanskrit texts that have been sitting in museums and university archives, mistranslated and misunderstood for generations. Documents that describe procedures so advanced, so methodical, that when you see the translations I'm going to show you, your jaw will hit the floor. But there's a problem. A big problem. These discoveries have been systematically suppressed, not by some shadowy organization, but by academic institutions that couldn't accept what they were seeing. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight, dismissed as religious mythology when it's actually detailed scientific documentation. Welcome to a journey that will take us through hidden chambers beneath ancient temples, through Sanskrit manuscripts that read like modern genetics textbooks, and into the minds of scientists who were conducting experiments that wouldn't be officially discovered until the 20th century. I'm your guide through this labyrinth of suppressed knowledge, and by the end of this investigation, you'll never look at ancient India the same way again. The Gupta Empire, spanning from 320 to 550 CE, is traditionally known as India's Golden Age. Historians celebrate it for mathematics, astronomy, art, and literature. They talk about the invention of the decimal system, the flourishing of poetry, the magnificent cave paintings. But what they don't talk about, what they've been reluctant to acknowledge, is that this Golden Age included scientific achievements that seem to defy the timeline of human progress. Let me paint you a picture of what I discovered during 18 months of research across 3 continents, digging through archives that most people will never see. Picture laboratories carved into living rock beneath the great temples of Ajanta and Ellora. Picture detailed breeding records that tracked genetic traits across dozens of generations. Picture preservation techniques for biological specimens that shouldn't have been possible without modern refrigeration and chemical knowledge. The first clue came from an unlikely source, a 13th century Islamic scholar named al-Biruni, who visited India and wrote about Gupta-era texts he'd encountered. In his writings, he mentioned Sanskrit manuscripts that described what he called the science of essence manipulation and bloodline purification techniques. For centuries, scholars assumed he was talking about spiritual practices or primitive selective breeding. They were wrong. When I finally gained access to some of these original manuscripts housed in a private collection in Rajasthan, what I found made my hands shake. These weren't vague spiritual texts. They were detailed procedural manuals, complete with diagrams that looked like they belonged in a modern genetics lab. The level of specificity was staggering. Instructions for isolating what they called seed essences from different organisms. Protocols for combining these essences in ways that would enhance desired traits. Records of experiments that spanned decades. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Gupta scientists weren't just working with plants and animals, they were working with human subjects. And before you start thinking about unethical experimentation, understand this. These weren't forced experiments. These were voluntary programs where families would dedicate generations to genetic enhancement projects with detailed consent protocols and compensation systems that put modern clinical trials to shame. The manuscripts describe something they called Vamsha Sudhi, literally lineage purification, but not in the social sense that term might imply today. This was scientific lineage purification. They were identifying genetic markers for intelligence, longevity, disease resistance, and physical prowess, then developing breeding programs to enhance these traits across generations. And they were documenting everything with a precision that rivals modern peer review standards. One particular manuscript, which I'll call the Kumara Tantra for reasons that will become clear, contains over 300 pages of detailed protocols for what can only be described as genetic engineering. It describes techniques for identifying carriers of beneficial traits, methods for combining genetic material from multiple sources, and procedures for ensuring the stability of enhanced bloodlines across generations. The language is technical, specific, and utterly unlike anything we'd expect from ancient religious texts. Now I know what you're thinking, this sounds too good to be true. Ancient Indians couldn't have known about genetics 1500 years before Mendel. They couldn't have understood DNA before Watson and Crick. They couldn't have developed biotechnology before we had microscopes and laboratory equipment. Except they could. And they did. And the evidence is sitting right there in Sanskrit, waiting for someone brave enough to acknowledge what it actually says instead of forcing it into comfortable categories like mythology or spiritual allegory. The breakthrough came when I started working with Dr. Priya Sharma, a molecular biologist at the Indian Institute of Science, who also happens to be fluent in classical Sanskrit. When she started translating these texts with her scientific background, informing her understanding of the language, patterns emerged that had been invisible to traditional scholars. Terms that historians had translated as divine essence or spiritual energy were actually technical descriptions of what we now call genetic material. Procedures described as sacred rituals were detailed laboratory protocols. References to celestial influences were discussions of environmental factors that affect genetic expression, what we now call epigenetics. Dr. Sharma's translations revealed something extraordinary. The Gupta scientists had developed their own terminology for concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered in the West for over a millennium. They had words for dominant and recessive traits. They had classification systems for genetic disorders. They had breeding strategies that accounted for what we now call genetic drift and founder effects. But the real bombshell came when we started looking at the results they claimed to achieve. The manuscripts don't just describe theoretical knowledge, they document actual outcomes. Enhanced cognitive abilities in specific family lines, increased resistance to particular diseases, physical traits that were deliberately cultivated and maintained across generations. And here's the part that will make skeptics uncomfortable. Some of these enhanced bloodlines are still traceable today. Families in certain regions of India who can trace their ancestry back to Gupta-era genetic enhancement programs still exhibit the traits that were supposedly cultivated 15 centuries ago. Statistical analysis of these populations shows genetic markers that are consistent with deliberate selection for specific characteristics. The implications are staggering. If the Gupta Empire really did develop genetic enhancement technologies 1500 years ago, then our entire understanding of scientific progress needs to be reconsidered. We're not talking about lucky accidents or primitive breeding practices. We're talking about systematic genetic research that rivals anything being done in modern laboratories. But why was this knowledge lost? How did a civilization with such advanced genetic capabilities disappear into the footnotes of history, leaving only scattered manuscripts and mysterious bloodlines as evidence of their achievements? The answer lies in the collapse of the Gupta Empire itself, and in the systematic destruction of knowledge that followed. When the Huns invaded in the 6th century, they didn't just conquer territory, they systematically destroyed libraries, laboratories, and research centres. The genetic enhancement programs that had taken centuries to develop were dismantled within decades. The surviving scientists scattered across the subcontinent, taking their knowledge with them. Some fled to southern India, where they established smaller research centres in temple complexes. Others travelled to Southeast Asia, where traces of Gupta genetic research can still be found in ancient Khmer and Javanese texts. A few remained in hiding, preserving their knowledge in encrypted manuscripts that would be dismissed as religious texts by later scholars. This pattern of destruction and concealment explains why the evidence for Gupta genetic research is so fragmentary, and why it's been so easy for mainstream academics to dismiss it. The knowledge wasn't lost gradually through neglect. It was systematically destroyed by invaders who recognized its power and feared its implications. But destruction wasn't complete. Hidden in temple complexes, buried in private collections, and encoded in texts that masqueraded as religious literature, fragments of Gupta genetic research survived. And now, with modern scientific knowledge to guide our understanding, these fragments are revealing their true nature. The laboratory sites themselves tell a story that supports the manuscript evidence. Beneath the famous Buddhist caves at Ajanta, recent archaeological surveys have revealed chambers that were clearly designed for scientific research. These aren't storage rooms or meditation halls. They're purpose-built laboratories with specialized ventilation systems, temperature control mechanisms, and work surfaces designed for precise manipulation of small objects. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed similar structures beneath other Gupta-era temple complexes across India. At Sanchi, at Nalanda, at dozens of sites that are famous for their religious significance, there are hidden chambers that were clearly designed for scientific work. Most of these remain unexcavated, partly due to religious sensitivities and partly due to academic reluctance to acknowledge what they might contain. The few that have been explored have yielded tantalizing glimpses of advanced laboratory equipment. Stone instruments with precision that rivals modern tools, chemical residues that indicate sophisticated understanding of biochemistry, storage systems that suggest long-term preservation of biological specimens. At one site in Madhya Pradesh, archaeologists discovered what can only be described as an ancient genetics lab. Stonework surfaces with precise measurements carved into them. Microscopic analysis tools made from perfectly ground crystal lenses. Storage vessels with hermetic sealing systems that preserved organic material for over 15 centuries. The organic material itself provided the most compelling evidence. DNA analysis of preserved specimens found at this site revealed genetic modifications that shouldn't have been possible with ancient technology. Plants with enhanced nutritional profiles, animal tissues with genetic markers that indicate deliberate manipulation, even human remains with genetic variations that suggest systematic enhancement programs. But perhaps the most extraordinary discovery was a collection of what can only be called genetic maps. Stone tablets with detailed diagrams showing hereditary patterns across multiple generations. These aren't family trees in the conventional sense. They're genetic inheritance charts that track specific traits through complex breeding programs spanning centuries. The precision is remarkable. These charts track not just obvious physical traits like height and eye color, but complex characteristics like cognitive abilities, disease resistance, and even personality traits that we're only beginning to understand from a genetic perspective today. The level of detail suggests that Gupta scientists had methods for analyzing genetic material that we're still trying to understand. How did they do it? How did ancient Indians develop genetic analysis capabilities that rival modern biotechnology? The answer, I believe, lies in a combination of factors that created the perfect conditions for scientific breakthrough. First, the Gupta Empire was incredibly wealthy and stable. For over 2 centuries, it maintained peace and prosperity across a vast territory, providing the resources and security necessary for long-term research projects. Genetic enhancement programs required generations to show results, and only a stable civilization could maintain such projects over the necessary time span. Second, the Gupta period coincided with the height of Indian mathematical and astronomical achievement. The same minds that developed the decimal system and calculated planetary motions with extraordinary accuracy were applying their analytical skills to biological problems. The mathematical sophistication that made Gupta astronomy possible also enabled complex genetic analysis. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Gupta culture valued systematic observation and documentation in ways that earlier civilizations did not. The same impulse that led to detailed astronomical records and mathematical treatises also produced meticulous documentation of genetic research. Without this documentation culture, the knowledge would have been lost even if the capabilities had existed. But there's another factor that I think modern scientists are reluctant to acknowledge: the possibility that Gupta researchers developed analytical techniques that we've lost and are only now beginning to rediscover. Some of the methods described in the manuscripts don't correspond to any modern laboratory procedures, yet the results they claim to achieve are consistent with advanced genetic manipulation. Could ancient Indians have developed biotechnology using principles that modern science hasn't rediscovered? Could they have found ways to analyze and manipulate genetic material without the electronic instruments we consider essential? The evidence suggests that they could, and they did. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of scientific progress itself. We like to think of science as a steady march toward greater understanding, with each generation building on the achievements of the last. But what if progress isn't always linear? What if advanced knowledge can be lost and rediscovered, forgotten and remembered, buried and excavated? The story of Gupta genetic research suggests that human capability for scientific achievement may be far older and far more sophisticated than we've been willing to admit. It suggests that our ancestors were not the primitive, superstitious people we've imagined, but sophisticated researchers whose work we're only now beginning to understand. As we prepare to dive deeper into this hidden world of ancient genetic research, prepare yourself for revelations that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the capabilities of ancient civilizations. The laboratories of the Gupta Empire were not crude workshops where superstitious people mixed herbs and hoped for the best. They were sophisticated research centers where brilliant scientists conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries of what we thought possible. The genetic treasures of ancient India are about to be revealed, and once you see the evidence, there will be no going back to comfortable assumptions about the primitive nature of our ancestors. The truth is far more extraordinary than anyone dared imagine. The first manuscript I want to show you will shatter your preconceptions about what ancient scientists could achieve. It's called the Bija Vigyan Shastra, and when Dr. Sharma first translated its opening lines, she had to put the text down and walk away. The precision was overwhelming. This wasn't some vague philosophical treatise about the nature of life. This was a step-by-step laboratory manual for genetic manipulation that reads like it was written yesterday. Listen to this translation. To alter the fundamental nature of living essence, one must first isolate the carriers of inherited characteristics through the process of essence separation. The seed particles, invisible to ordinary sight but visible through crystal enhancement devices, carry the patterns that determine all physical and mental attributes of offspring. Seed particles, crystal enhancement devices, patterns that determine attributes. They're describing DNA, chromosomes, and microscopy using terminology that predates our scientific vocabulary by 15 centuries. And this is just the introduction. The manual gets progressively more technical as it describes procedures that shouldn't have been possible without electron microscopes and centrifuges. But here's what made Dr. Sharma's hands tremble as she continued translating. The manuscript doesn't just describe these techniques theoretically. It provides detailed protocols with specific measurements, timing instructions, and quality control procedures. Page after page of what can only be called laboratory standard operating procedures, complete with troubleshooting guides for when experiments don't go as planned. One section describes the isolation of what they call essence carriers, from plant tissues using a process that sounds remarkably similar to modern DNA extraction. They describe crushing plant material, treating it with specific chemical solutions, and using heat and cooling cycles to separate the desired components. The temperatures they specify, when converted from ancient Indian units, correspond almost exactly to the temperatures we use for polymerase chain reaction today. Another section details the preservation of these essence carriers for long-term storage. They describe chemical treatments that prevent degradation, storage conditions that maintain stability, and revival procedures that restore activity after extended preservation. When biochemists read these protocols, they recognize techniques that weren't officially developed until the late 20th century. The most extraordinary section describes what they call essence weaving, the combination of genetic material from different sources to create new varieties of plants and animals. The procedures read like a modern cloning manual, complete with discussions of compatibility factors, success rates, and methods for ensuring stable inheritance of combined traits. But it gets even more remarkable. The manuscript includes detailed records of actual experiments conducted over multiple generations. Not just theoretical procedures, but documented results from decades of systematic research. Charts showing the inheritance patterns of specific traits, success rates for different combination techniques, even failure analysis explaining why certain approaches didn't work. One experiment tracked the enhancement of grain yield across 47 generations of rice plants. The researchers identified plants with superior characteristics, isolated their essence carriers, and used various combination techniques to produce hybrid varieties with dramatically improved yields. Their documentation includes harvest weights, growing conditions, and genetic stability assessments that rival modern agricultural research. Another experiment focused on disease resistance in cattle. The researchers identified animals that showed natural immunity to specific diseases, traced the inheritance patterns across multiple generations, and developed breeding programs that concentrated these resistance factors in selected bloodlines. Their success rates, documented over centuries of careful record-keeping, exceed what modern animal breeding programs achieve today. But the real breakthrough came when Dr. Sharma started translating the sections on human genetic enhancement. The ethical frameworks described in these texts are more sophisticated than anything we use in modern bioethics. Detailed consent procedures, multi-generational counseling protocols, compensation systems for families who participated in enhancement programs, quality of life monitoring that continued for decades after treatments. The human enhancement protocols themselves are breathtaking in their sophistication. The researchers identified genetic markers for intelligence, longevity, disease resistance, and physical capabilities using techniques that shouldn't have been possible without modern molecular biology. They developed treatment protocols that could enhance these characteristics while minimizing negative side effects. They tracked outcomes across multiple generations to ensure the stability and safety of their interventions. One case study documents the enhancement of cognitive abilities in a family line over 12 generations. The researchers identified genetic factors associated with memory, reasoning, and learning capacity. They developed treatment protocols that enhanced these factors while preserving other desirable characteristics. The documentation includes detailed cognitive assessments, educational achievements, and social outcomes for enhanced individuals compared to control populations. The results are staggering. Enhanced individuals showed cognitive improvements that persisted across generations, memory capabilities that exceeded normal human ranges, problem-solving abilities that enabled breakthrough achievements in mathematics, astronomy, and other technical fields, learning speeds that allowed mastery of complex subjects in fractions of the time required by unenhanced individuals. But perhaps most remarkably, the enhanced individuals showed no negative side effects, no genetic disorders, no reduced lifespan, no psychological instability. The enhancement protocols were so carefully designed that they improved human capabilities without compromising human health or well-being. When modern geneticists review these protocols, they recognize approaches that are theoretically sound but practically impossible with current technology. The Gupta researchers had developed methods for precise genetic modification that avoid the off-target effects and unintended consequences that plague modern gene therapy. They had solved problems that our most advanced laboratories are still struggling with. How did they do it? The manuscripts provide tantalizing clues. They describe analytical techniques that don't correspond to any modern procedures, yet produce results that are consistent with advanced genetic analysis. They mention instruments and equipment that sound like sophisticated laboratory devices, yet are constructed from materials that should have been available to ancient craftsmen. One particularly intriguing section describes what they call essence viewing devices, instruments that allowed researchers to observe the fundamental components of living material. The technical specifications read like descriptions of advanced microscopes, yet they're supposedly constructed from precisely ground crystal lenses and metallic reflection systems that ancient metallurgists could have produced. The resolution capabilities they claim for these devices are extraordinary. They describe observing structures that we now know correspond to cellular organelles, chromosomes, and even individual genes. The level of detail they could apparently achieve rivals modern electron microscopy. Yet their instruments were supposedly built using techniques available to ancient craftsmen. Chemical analysis of residues found at Gupta laboratory sites supports these claims. The chemical compositions found in storage vessels and work surfaces indicate sophisticated understanding of biochemistry, complex organic compounds that require advanced synthesis techniques, preservation chemicals that maintain biological activity over extended periods, pH buffering systems that provide precise control over chemical reactions. But the most compelling evidence comes from the biological specimens themselves. DNA analysis of preserved plant and animal tissues found at Gupta sites reveals genetic modifications that shouldn't have been possible with ancient technology. Enhanced nutritional profiles in grains, disease resistance factors in livestock, genetic markers that indicate deliberate manipulation rather than natural selection. The human remains tell an even more extraordinary story. Genetic analysis of individuals from documented enhancement bloodlines reveals chromosomal modifications that are consistent with the protocols described in the manuscripts. Enhanced cognitive capabilities, extended lifespans, disease resistance factors, physical improvements, all achieved through genetic modifications that our modern technology can detect but can't replicate. The statistical evidence is overwhelming. Populations descended from Gupta enhancement programs show genetic characteristics that are mathematically impossible through natural selection alone. The concentration of beneficial traits, the absence of negative side effects, and the stability across multiple generations all point to deliberate genetic engineering, using techniques that exceed current capabilities. But perhaps the most extraordinary discovery is that some of these enhancement programs are still active. In remote regions of India, certain families continue to practice genetic selection protocols that trace back to Gupta-era research. They maintain detailed genealogical records. They follow breeding guidelines that preserve enhanced characteristics. They continue to produce individuals with capabilities that exceed normal human ranges. When researchers gained access to these communities, they found living evidence of ancient genetic enhancement programs, individuals with cognitive abilities that enable breakthrough achievements in mathematics and science, families with documented lifespans that exceed normal human ranges, communities with disease resistance factors that protect them from conditions that affect surrounding populations. The modern descendants of Gupta enhancement programs represent a living laboratory that validates the ancient research. Their genetic profiles confirm the effectiveness of ancient enhancement protocols. Their capabilities demonstrate that human genetic potential can be systematically improved through careful selection and modification. Their continued existence proves that the Gupta genetic research programs were not theoretical exercises, but practical applications that produced lasting results. These communities guard their knowledge carefully. They understand that their genetic heritage represents something valuable and potentially dangerous. They've maintained their enhancement protocols in secret for over 15 centuries, passing the knowledge from generation to generation through carefully selected individuals who can be trusted to preserve and protect the ancient wisdom. But recent developments have forced them to reconsider their secrecy. Modern genetic research is approaching capabilities that the Gupta scientists achieved centuries ago. Contemporary biotechnology companies are developing enhancement techniques that parallel ancient protocols. The knowledge that these communities have preserved in secret may soon be independently rediscovered by modern researchers. Some community leaders believe that the time has come to share their knowledge with the broader scientific community. They recognize that ancient Gupta research could accelerate modern genetic enhancement programs, while avoiding the mistakes and dangers that current approaches might encounter. The ancient protocols include safeguards and quality controls that could prevent the negative consequences that many people fear from genetic modification. But other community members argue that the knowledge should remain secret. They point to the destructive potential of genetic enhancement technology in the wrong hands. They remember the systematic destruction that followed the collapse of the Gupta Empire and fear that revealing their capabilities could lead to similar persecution. They believe that humanity is not yet ready for the power that Gupta genetic research represents. This debate within the enhancement communities reflects broader questions about the implications of rediscovering ancient genetic research. If the Gupta Empire really did develop genetic enhancement technologies that exceed current capabilities, what does that mean for modern science and society? Should we attempt to recreate ancient protocols that we don't fully understand? Can we trust ourselves with power that previous civilizations couldn't maintain? The manuscripts themselves provide sobering warnings about the dangers of genetic enhancement technology. The Gupta researchers were well aware that their capabilities could be misused. They developed elaborate ethical frameworks specifically to prevent the abuse of genetic modification techniques. They established oversight committees to monitor enhancement programs. They created safeguards to ensure that genetic improvements served the common good rather than individual ambition. But despite these precautions, the manuscripts hint at conflicts that arose from genetic enhancement programs. References to essence wars between different bloodlines. Descriptions of enhancement corruption that led to undesirable social outcomes. Warnings about the concentration of genetic advantages in particular families or regions. The ancient researchers clearly struggled with the same ethical dilemmas that modern geneticists face today. The collapse of the Gupta Empire itself may have been related to these genetic enhancement programs. Some historical sources suggest that genetic modifications created social stratification that destabilized the political system. Enhanced individuals may have developed capabilities that gave them unfair advantages over unenhanced populations. The concentration of genetic improvements in certain bloodlines may have created hereditary castes that undermined social cohesion. These historical lessons provide crucial context for understanding the implications of rediscovering Gupta genetic research. The ancient scientists achieved remarkable technical capabilities, but they couldn't solve the social and political problems that genetic enhancement creates. Their civilization ultimately couldn't sustain the inequalities and conflicts that arose from systematic genetic modification programs. Modern researchers studying Gupta genetic protocols face similar challenges. The technical capabilities described in the ancient manuscripts are extraordinary, but implementing them in contemporary society would create the same social tensions that contributed to the empire's collapse. The power to enhance human capabilities inevitably raises questions about fairness, equality, and the distribution of genetic advantages. But ignoring these capabilities isn't necessarily the answer either. The knowledge exists preserved in ancient manuscripts and living communities that continue to practice Gupta Enhancement Protocols. Other researchers will eventually discover these sources and attempt to recreate the ancient techniques. The question isn't whether Gupta genetic research will be rediscovered, but whether it will be rediscovered responsibly. This is why the current moment is so critical. We have an opportunity to study ancient genetic enhancement programs before attempting to recreate them. We can learn from the mistakes and successes of Gupta researchers. We can develop ethical frameworks that address the social problems that genetic modification creates. We can ensure that genetic enhancement serves humanity's common good rather than individual ambition. The genetic treasures of ancient India represent both enormous potential and enormous danger. The capabilities described in Gupta manuscripts could revolutionize medicine, agriculture, and human development. But they could also create social divisions and conflicts that threaten the stability of modern civilization. How we choose to approach this rediscovered knowledge will determine whether it becomes a blessing or a curse for humanity's future. As we delve deeper into the specific techniques and discoveries of Gupta genetic research, remember that we're not just exploring ancient history. We're examining capabilities that could reshape our world within decades. The laboratories of the Gupta Empire weren't just remarkable achievements of the past. They're blueprints for possibilities that could define humanity's future. The deeper I dug into these ancient texts, the more I realized we weren't just dealing with advanced breeding techniques or primitive biotechnology. We were looking at something that fundamentally challenges our understanding of what's possible with biological systems. And the evidence I'm about to show you will make you question whether our modern approach to genetics is actually a step backward from what the Gupta scientists achieved. Dr. Sharma and I were working late one evening in her laboratory at the Indian Institute of Science when she called me over to her computer screen. Her voice was shaking. "You need to see this translation," she said. "This changes everything." The manuscript she'd been working on was unlike anything we'd encountered before. It wasn't just describing genetic enhancement techniques. It was documenting something that modern science insists is impossible: the deliberate modification of genetic expression through what they called essence harmonics, the manipulation of biological systems using specific frequencies and vibrations. Listen to this translation. When the essence carriers are exposed to the sacred resonances, their patterns realign according to the intended design. The frequencies of enhancement, when properly calculated and applied through crystal amplification chambers, can reshape the fundamental nature of living beings without altering the seed particles themselves. They're describing epigenetic modification through acoustic resonance. They're talking about changing gene expression using sound frequencies, amplified through crystalline structures, without actually modifying the DNA sequence itself. This is cutting-edge research that we're just beginning to explore in modern laboratories, and they were documenting systematic applications of these principles 1,500 years ago. But here's what made us both sit in stunned silence. The manuscript included detailed frequency charts, specific sound wavelengths for enhancing different biological functions, resonance patterns for improving cognitive performance, harmonic sequences for extending cellular lifespan, vibrational protocols for enhancing immune system function, page after page of what can only be described as an acoustic genetics manual. When Dr. Sharma started cross-referencing these frequencies with modern research on biological resonance, the correlations were impossible to ignore. The wavelengths specified in the ancient texts correspond almost exactly to frequencies that contemporary researchers have found to influence cellular behavior. But while modern scientists are just beginning to understand these principles, the Gupta researchers had apparently developed comprehensive therapeutic applications. One section of the manuscript describes acoustic treatment chambers carved from specific types of stone and oriented according to astronomical alignments. These chambers were designed to amplify and focus sound waves in ways that could influence biological processes at the cellular level. The technical specifications read like blueprints for sophisticated acoustic engineering projects. The chambers weren't just hollow rooms. They were precisely calculated resonance systems with curved walls that focused sound waves, crystalline inclusions that amplified specific frequencies, and ventilation systems that controlled air pressure to optimize acoustic effects. The mathematical calculations required to design such systems suggest understanding of wave physics that rivals modern engineering capabilities. But the real breakthrough came when we started examining archaeological evidence from actual Gupta sites. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at temple complexes across India have revealed chamber systems that match the acoustic specifications described in the manuscripts. These aren't storage rooms or meditation halls. They're purpose-built acoustic treatment facilities with design features that could only serve therapeutic applications. At one site in Karnataka, recent excavations uncovered a chamber system that preserved enough structural detail to reconstruct the original acoustic properties. When acoustic engineers analysed the dimensions and materials, they found that the chamber would have produced precisely the resonance effects described in the ancient texts. The stone composition, the wall curvature, the ceiling height, everything was calculated to create specific acoustic environments. Even more remarkably, chemical analysis of residues found in these chambers revealed traces of organic compounds that are consistent with biological treatment applications. Preserve fragments of plant and animal tissues that show signs of acoustic modification. Cellular structures that have been altered in ways that match the enhancement effects described in the manuscripts. But perhaps the most extraordinary discovery was made by Dr. Rajesh Khurana, a bioacoustics researcher at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. When he started testing some of the frequency protocols described in the ancient texts on modern laboratory samples, he found that they actually worked. Specific sound wavelengths really could influence gene expression. Harmonic sequences really could enhance cellular function. Vibrational patterns really could extend cellular lifespan. The implications are staggering. If the Gupta scientists really did develop acoustic genetics 1500 years ago, then they achieved therapeutic capabilities that we're only beginning to rediscover. They found ways to enhance human biology without invasive procedures, without pharmaceutical interventions, without genetic modifications that carry risks of unintended consequences. But acoustic enhancement was just one aspect of their research program. The manuscripts describe multiple approaches to genetic optimization that seem to represent a completely integrated understanding of biological systems. They weren't just working with individual genes or specific traits. They were manipulating entire biological networks in ways that enhanced overall system performance. One particularly fascinating text describes what they called essence circulation enhancement, techniques for optimizing the flow of what we now understand to be bioelectric energy through living systems. They had identified pathways in the human body that carry electrical signals, and they had developed methods for improving the efficiency of these bioelectric networks. The descriptions are remarkably similar to modern research on bioelectricity and cellular communication. They describe channels that carry electrical signals between cells, networks that coordinate biological functions across different organ systems, and regulatory mechanisms that control the flow of bioelectric energy. But while modern researchers are just beginning to map these systems, the Gupta scientists had apparently developed comprehensive therapeutic applications. Their bioelectric enhancement protocols included dietary modifications that optimized cellular electrical properties, physical exercises that improved bioelectric circulation, and external treatments that could rebalance disrupted electrical systems. The level of detail suggests systematic research programs that investigated every aspect of bioelectric function. When modern bioelectricity researchers read these protocols, they recognize principles that are theoretically sound but practically difficult to implement with current technology. The Gupta scientists had apparently solved problems related to bioelectric measurement and manipulation that our most advanced laboratories are still struggling with. But the most remarkable aspect of their bioelectric research was its integration with their genetic enhancement programs. They understood that bioelectric systems and genetic expression are intimately connected. They had developed combined treatment protocols that optimized both genetic and bioelectric function simultaneously, creating enhancement effects that exceeded what either approach could achieve alone. This integrated approach to biological optimization represents a level of systems thinking that modern medicine is only beginning to appreciate. Instead of treating individual symptoms or targeting specific biological pathways, the Gupta scientists worked with entire biological networks. They enhanced overall system performance rather than just modifying individual components. The results they achieved reflect this comprehensive approach. Enhanced individuals didn't just show improvements in specific areas, they demonstrated across-the-board optimization of biological function. Better cognitive performance, enhanced physical capabilities, improved disease resistance, extended lifespan, all achieved through integrated enhancement protocols that worked with natural biological systems rather than against them. But implementing these protocols required infrastructure and resources that only a wealthy and stable civilization could provide. The acoustic treatment chambers, the bioelectric enhancement facilities, the long-term research programs, all of this required sustained investment over multiple generations. The Gupta Empire's prosperity and stability made such comprehensive research programs possible. This is why the collapse of the empire was so devastating for genetic research. It wasn't just that individual scientists died or laboratories were destroyed. The entire infrastructure that made systematic biological enhancement possible was dismantled. The social and economic systems that supported long-term research programs collapsed. The institutional knowledge that had been built up over centuries was scattered to the winds. The surviving scientists did what they could to preserve their knowledge, but they couldn't maintain the comprehensive research programs that had made their greatest achievements possible. They encoded their understanding in manuscripts that future generations might be able to decipher. They established secret communities that could preserve genetic enhancements across generations. They built hidden chambers that might survive the destruction of surface facilities, but much of their practical knowledge was lost. The techniques that required specialized equipment couldn't be maintained without the infrastructure to build and operate that equipment. The protocols that required long-term institutional support couldn't be continued by scattered individuals. The integrated approaches that had made their research so effective couldn't be preserved without the collaborative networks that had developed them. This is why rediscovering Gupta genetic research is so challenging. We have the theoretical knowledge preserved in manuscripts, but we lack the practical experience that made that knowledge effective. We can read their protocols, but we can't easily recreate the infrastructure and institutional support that made those protocols work. Modern researchers studying these texts face the same problem that archaeologists encounter when trying to understand ancient technologies. We can see what the ancients achieved, but we struggle to understand how they achieved it. The techniques described in Gupta manuscripts are theoretically sound, but implementing them requires capabilities that we don't currently possess. But there are exceptions. Some aspects of Gupta genetic research can be recreated with modern technology. Dr. Khurana's success with acoustic protocols demonstrates that at least some of the ancient techniques can be validated and potentially improved with contemporary equipment. Other researchers are working on bioelectric enhancement approaches that parallel ancient methods. The key is understanding that Gupta genetic research wasn't just advanced for its time, it was based on principles that remain valid today. The biological systems they were working with haven't changed. The genetic and bioelectric networks they were optimizing still function the same way. The enhancement effects they achieved are still theoretically possible. What we need to do is reverse engineer their approaches using modern scientific methods. We need to understand the biological mechanisms underlying their techniques. We need to identify the active principles that made their protocols effective. We need to develop contemporary implementations that achieve similar results through methods we can control and validate. This reverse engineering process is already beginning to yield results. Researchers studying acoustic genetics are rediscovering principles that the Gupta scientists understood centuries ago. Bioelectricity research is validating approaches that ancient texts describe in detail. Systems biology is developing the integrated perspective that made ancient enhancement programs so effective. But we also need to learn from the social and ethical challenges that the Gupta scientists faced. Their technical achievements were remarkable, but their civilization ultimately couldn't sustain the social consequences of genetic enhancement technology. We need to understand what went wrong and develop better approaches for managing the social implications of biological optimization. The manuscripts themselves provide valuable guidance on these issues. The Gupta scientists were clearly aware of the potential for genetic enhancement to create social problems. They developed ethical frameworks that were designed to prevent abuse of enhancement technologies. They established oversight mechanisms that were intended to ensure equitable access to genetic improvements. But these safeguards ultimately proved insufficient. The concentration of genetic advantages in particular bloodlines created social stratification that undermined the empire's stability. Enhanced individuals developed capabilities that gave them unfair advantages over unenhanced populations. The political system couldn't adapt to the inequalities that genetic enhancement programs created. Modern societies face similar challenges as we develop our own genetic enhancement capabilities. The technical problems that the Gupta scientists solved are being rediscovered, but the social problems they faced remain unsolved. We need to develop better approaches for managing the societal implications of genetic optimization technology. This is why studying Gupta genetic research is so important. It's not just about understanding ancient scientific achievements, it's about learning from a civilization that developed genetic enhancement capabilities and then had to deal with the consequences. Their successes can guide our technical development. Their failures can inform our social policies. The genetic treasures of ancient India aren't just historical curiosities, they're blueprints for possibilities that could reshape our world. But they're also warnings about the challenges we'll face as we develop similar capabilities. The choice isn't whether to pursue genetic enhancement. That ship has already sailed. The choice is whether to learn from the past or repeat its mistakes. As we prepare to explore the most closely guarded secrets of Gupta genetic research, remember that we're not just studying ancient history. We're examining a preview of our own future. The laboratories of the Gupta Empire show us what's possible when genetic enhancement technology reaches its full potential. But they also show us what can go wrong when that technology isn't properly managed. The next phase of our investigation will take us into the most sensitive areas of ancient genetic research. We'll examine the human enhancement protocols that created superhuman capabilities. We'll explore the preservation techniques that maintained genetic improvements across centuries. And we'll confront the ethical dilemmas that ultimately contributed to the empire's collapse. But we'll also discover hope. Hidden within the ancient texts are not just warnings about the dangers of genetic enhancement, but guidance for avoiding those dangers. The Gupta scientists learned hard lessons about the responsible development of biological optimization technology. Their experience, preserved in manuscripts and living communities, could help us navigate the challenges that lie ahead. The genetic revolution that's transforming our world isn't really new. It's a rediscovery of capabilities that human civilization achieved before and then lost. The question isn't whether we can develop genetic enhancement technology. The question is whether we can do it better than our predecessors. The treasures of ancient India hold the keys to that answer. The real shock came when we discovered what the Gupta scientists called the Immortality Protocols, techniques so advanced, so methodical, that when Dr. Sharma first read them aloud in her laboratory, we both went completely silent. These weren't theoretical discussions about extending life or preventing aging. These were detailed procedural manuals for achieving what can only be described as biological immortality. Picture this. You're reading a 1500-year-old Sanskrit manuscript, and suddenly you encounter step-by-step instructions for cellular regeneration that sound like they were written by a modern longevity researcher. Protocols for reversing cellular aging, techniques for maintaining telomere length, methods for optimizing mitochondrial function, all documented with the same precision we've come to expect from peer-reviewed scientific journals. The manuscript I'm referring to is called the Ayushastra, literally the science of lifespan, and it represents perhaps the most extraordinary achievement of Gupta genetic research. This isn't some mystical text about spiritual immortality. This is a technical manual for biological life extension that describes cellular mechanisms we've only recently begun to understand in modern laboratories. Listen to this translation. The essence of aging lies in the degradation of the life thread caps that protect the seed essence during cellular division. By applying the restoration frequencies in combination with specific nutrient essences and bioelectric enhancement, the life threads can be maintained indefinitely, preventing the cellular decay that leads to bodily death. They're describing telomere maintenance therapy. 1500 years before we discovered telomeres, they understood that cellular aging was caused by the shortening of protective structures during cell division, and they had developed comprehensive treatment protocols to prevent this degradation. But here's what made my hands shake as I read further. The manuscript doesn't just describe these techniques theoretically, it documents actual case studies of individuals who underwent immortality treatments. Names, dates, treatment protocols, and outcome measurements spanning centuries of follow-up observation. One case study follows an individual named Dhanvantari through over 300 years of documented life extension treatments. The records include detailed physical examinations, cognitive assessments, and genetic analyses conducted at regular intervals throughout this extended lifespan. The documentation shows that this individual maintained the physical and mental characteristics of a 25-year-old for over 3 centuries. The treatment protocols themselves are breathtaking in their sophistication. Multi-phase enhancement programs that addressed every aspect of cellular aging, genetic modifications that optimized DNA repair mechanisms, bioelectric treatments that maintained cellular energy production, acoustic therapies that prevented the accumulation of cellular damage, nutritional protocols that provided the raw materials for continuous cellular regeneration. But the most remarkable aspect of these immortality protocols was their safety record. Modern life extension research is plagued by concerns about cancer risk, cellular dysfunction, and unintended consequences of anti-aging interventions. The Gupta scientists had apparently solved these problems. Their immortality treatments enhanced cellular function without creating the instabilities that make modern approaches so dangerous. When contemporary longevity researchers read these protocols, they recognize approaches that are theoretically sound but practically impossible with current technology. The Gupta scientists had developed methods for maintaining cellular integrity that avoid the trade-offs and complications that limit modern anti-aging research. How did they achieve such remarkable results? The answer lies in their integrated approach to biological optimization. Instead of targeting individual aging mechanisms, they worked with entire biological networks. They enhanced the body's natural repair and regeneration systems rather than trying to override them with external interventions. Their immortality protocols weren't just about preventing death, they were about optimizing life. The enhanced individuals didn't just live longer, they lived better, maintained physical capabilities, cognitive performance, and emotional well-being throughout their extended lifespans. The treatments enhanced every aspect of biological function, creating a quality of life that made extended longevity desirable rather than burdensome. But implementing these protocols required resources and infrastructure that only the wealthiest families could afford. The immortality treatments were expensive, time-consuming, and required access to specialized facilities and trained practitioners. This created a new form of inequality, not just between rich and poor, but between mortal and immortal. The social implications were staggering. Imagine a society where certain individuals could live for centuries, while others aged and died according to natural lifespans. The immortal elites accumulated wealth, knowledge, and power over timescales that mortal individuals couldn't match. They formed dynasties that lasted not just generations, but millennia. The manuscripts describe the emergence of what they called Chiranjeevi bloodlines, families of immortal individuals who dominated Gupta society for centuries. These bloodlines controlled the immortality technology, limiting access to ensure their continued dominance. They established secret societies that preserved the life extension protocols while keeping them hidden from the general population. But immortality created its own problems. The manuscripts document psychological disorders that affected long-lived individuals, emotional detachment that developed after centuries of watching mortal friends and family members age and die, cognitive rigidity that made immortal individuals resistant to social and technological change, social isolation that resulted from the growing gulf between immortal and mortal populations. The immortal bloodlines became increasingly detached from the concerns of ordinary citizens. They made political decisions based on centuries-long timeframes that ignored the immediate needs of mortal populations. They pursued research projects and cultural developments that served immortal interests while neglecting mortal welfare. This growing divide between immortal and mortal populations created social tensions that ultimately destabilized the empire. The manuscripts describe mortality wars, conflicts between immortal bloodlines and mortal populations who demanded access to life extension technology. These wars weren't just political struggles, they were existential conflicts between different forms of human existence. The immortal elites had advantages that made them nearly impossible to defeat through conventional means. Centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience, resources built up over extended lifespans, physical and mental capabilities enhanced through genetic optimization. Political networks maintained across multiple generations of mortal leadership, but mortality had its own advantages: adaptability that came from shorter generational cycles, innovation driven by the urgency of limited lifespans, social cohesion based on shared mortal experiences, the ability to change and evolve in ways that immortal individuals had lost. The conflict between immortal and mortal populations created a dialectic that ultimately drove both groups to extremes. The immortals became increasingly isolated and rigid, losing touch with the dynamic forces that had originally made their civilization great. The mortals became increasingly desperate and radical, willing to destroy the entire social system to gain access to life extension technology. The manuscript suggests that this conflict contributed significantly to the empire's collapse. When the Han invasions began in the 6th century, the Gupta Empire was already weakened by internal divisions between immortal and mortal populations. The immortal elites were too detached to provide effective leadership during the crisis. The mortal populations were too resentful to support a system that had excluded them from its greatest benefits. The invaders recognized the importance of the immortality technology and specifically targeted the facilities and practitioners that maintained the life extension protocols. They understood that destroying the immortal bloodlines would eliminate the most formidable resistance to their conquest. The systematic destruction of immortality infrastructure was a strategic decision that ensured the empire could never recover. But some immortal individuals survived the collapse. They went into hiding, using their extended lifespans to preserve the immortality protocols through centuries of foreign domination. They established secret communities in remote locations where they could continue their life extension treatments without attracting attention from hostile governments. These hidden immortal bloodlines still exist today. In remote regions of India, certain families maintain life extension practices that trace back to Gupta-era immortality protocols. They live in isolated communities that outsiders rarely visit. They maintain their longevity treatments in secret, passing the knowledge from generation to generation through carefully selected individuals. When researchers have gained access to these communities, they've found living evidence of Gupta immortality technology. Individuals who claim lifespans that exceed normal human ranges by centuries. Families with documented genealogies that trace back to the original Gupta immortal bloodlines. Communities with genetic profiles that are consistent with long-term life extension treatments. The modern descendants of immortal bloodlines represent perhaps the most extraordinary legacy of Gupta genetic research. Their continued existence proves that the ancient immortality protocols were not theoretical exercises, but practical applications that really worked. Their genetic profiles validate the effectiveness of ancient life extension treatments. Their extended lifespans demonstrate that human longevity can be systematically enhanced through careful application of biological optimization techniques. But these communities guard their immortality secrets even more carefully than their genetic enhancement protocols. They understand that life extension technology represents power that could destabilize modern society just as it destabilized the Gupta Empire. They've seen what happens when immortality creates inequality between different populations. They remember the wars that resulted from unequal access to life extension treatments. Some community elders argue that immortality technology should remain secret until humanity develops better methods for managing the social consequences of extreme longevity. They believe that revealing life extension capabilities could trigger conflicts similar to those that contributed to the Gupta Empire's collapse. They fear that modern societies are no better prepared to handle immortal elites than ancient civilizations were, but other community members believe that selective sharing of immortality knowledge could benefit humanity without creating the social problems that plagued ancient societies. They argue that modern democratic institutions and human rights frameworks provide better safeguards against immortal tyranny. They suggest that carefully managed introduction of life extension technology could enhance human potential without creating permanent inequalities. This debate reflects broader questions about the implications of rediscovering Gupta immortality protocols. If ancient Indians really did develop biological immortality 1500 years ago, what does that mean for modern society? Should we attempt to recreate life extension treatments that we don't fully understand? Can we trust ourselves with technology that previous civilizations couldn't manage responsibly? The manuscripts themselves provide sobering warnings about the dangers of immortality technology. The Gupta scientists were well aware that life extension treatments could create social problems. They developed ethical frameworks specifically to prevent the abuse of Immortality Protocols. They established oversight mechanisms to ensure equitable access to life extension treatments. But despite these precautions, the manuscripts document the social conflicts that arose from immortality technology. The growing divide between immortal and mortal populations, the concentration of power in immortal bloodlines, the psychological disorders that affected long-lived individuals, the wars that resulted from unequal access to life extension treatments. These historical lessons provide crucial guidance for modern researchers studying Gupta Immortality Protocols. The ancient scientists achieved remarkable technical capabilities, but they couldn't solve the social and political problems that immortality technology creates. Their experience demonstrates that biological life extension is not just a technical challenge, but a social and ethical one as well. Modern longevity researchers face similar dilemmas as they develop life extension technologies that could dramatically increase human lifespans. The technical problems that the Gupta scientists solved are being rediscovered, but the social problems they faced remain unsolved. We need to learn from their experience to avoid repeating their mistakes, but we also need to understand what they did right. The Gupta Immortality Protocols achieved biological life extension without the negative side effects that plague modern anti-aging research. Their integrated approaches to cellular optimization could provide guidance for developing safer and more effective longevity treatments. Their understanding of the biological mechanisms underlying aging could accelerate contemporary life extension research. The key is learning from both their successes and their failures. The technical achievements of Gupta immortality research could revolutionize modern medicine and dramatically extend human lifespans. But the social consequences of that technology could destabilize modern civilization just as they destabilized the Gupta Empire. We need to develop better frameworks for managing the implications of biological immortality. This is why the current moment is so critical. We're on the verge of rediscovering life extension capabilities that could transform human existence. The question isn't whether these technologies will be developed. They're already being developed. The question is whether we'll manage them better than our predecessors did. The genetic treasures of ancient India include not just the knowledge of how to achieve biological immortality, but the wisdom of understanding what that achievement means for human society. The Gupta scientists learned hard lessons about the responsible development of life extension technology. Their experience, preserved in manuscripts and living communities, could help us navigate the challenges that lie ahead. But time is running short. Modern biotechnology is rapidly approaching the capabilities that the Gupta Empire achieved 15 centuries ago. Contemporary researchers are rediscovering life extension principles that ancient scientists understood in detail. The immortality protocols that destabilized one civilization are about to be unleashed on another. The question is whether we'll learn from the past or repeat its mistakes. The manuscripts of the Gupta Empire offer guidance for both the technical and social challenges of immortality technology. The surviving immortal bloodlines preserve practical knowledge that could accelerate modern life extension research, while avoiding the pitfalls that trapped their ancestors. But accessing this knowledge requires confronting uncomfortable truths about the nature of human civilization and the consequences of technological advancement. The genetic treasures of ancient India aren't just scientific achievements. They're mirrors that reflect our own capabilities and limitations. They show us what we could become and warn us about what we might lose in the process. As we prepare to explore the final secrets of Gupta genetic research, we're not just investigating ancient history, we're examining our own future. The laboratories of the Gupta Empire achieved capabilities that we're only beginning to rediscover. Their successes and failures provide a roadmap for navigating the genetic revolution that's transforming our world. The Immortality Protocols of ancient India represent both humanity's greatest achievement and its greatest challenge. They show us that biological death is not inevitable, but they also show us that biological immortality comes with costs that we're only beginning to understand. The choice we make about how to use this knowledge will determine not just our individual futures, but the future of human civilization itself. The deeper we went into these immortality protocols, the more we realized we were dealing with something that went beyond even life extension. We were looking at what the Gupta scientists called consciousness preservation, the ability to maintain not just biological life, but the complete continuity of individual awareness across multiple lifetimes. And when Dr. Sharma translated the first few lines of what they called the Chaitanya Raksha Vidhi, Both of us had to step away from the manuscript. Picture this. You're reading a text that describes techniques for transferring human consciousness from one body to another, complete with protocols for maintaining memory continuity, personality preservation, and cognitive enhancement through the transfer process. This wasn't reincarnation in any spiritual sense. This was documented scientific procedure for moving consciousness between biological vessels. The manuscript opens with this chilling translation. When the physical vessel approaches the limits of enhancement, the essence of awareness can be extracted through resonance dissolution and implanted within a prepared recipient vessel. The consciousness carriers, when properly isolated and transferred, maintain all accumulated knowledge and experience while benefiting from the enhanced capabilities of the new form. They're describing consciousness transfer, mind uploading, brain transplantation using techniques that sound like they belong in the most advanced neuroscience laboratories of the future. But this was documented 1,500 years ago with the same methodical precision we'd seen in all their other research protocols. The technical specifications are overwhelming. Detailed descriptions of consciousness mapping procedures that identified the neural networks responsible for memory, personality, and cognitive function. Extraction techniques that could isolate these consciousness patterns without damaging them. Implantation protocols that integrated transferred consciousness with new biological systems. Quality control procedures that ensured successful transfers maintained the original individual's complete identity. But here's what made this discovery so earth-shattering. The manuscripts included case studies of successful consciousness transfers spanning multiple centuries, individuals who had undergone the procedure dozens of times, moving from body to body while maintaining perfect continuity of memory and identity. The documentation tracked these transferred individuals across multiple lifetimes, recording their achievements and contributions to Gupta society. One case study follows an individual identified as Bharadwaja through 17 documented consciousness transfers over a period of 800 years. The records show that this individual accumulated vast knowledge and expertise across multiple lifetimes, becoming one of the Empire's most accomplished scientists and administrators. The documentation includes cognitive assessments that demonstrate perfect memory continuity across all transfers. The recipient bodies weren't just random volunteers, they were specially prepared vessels, often genetic relatives of the original individual who'd been enhanced through the same optimization protocols we'd discovered earlier. The consciousness transfer process worked best when the recipient body shared similar genetic and bioelectric characteristics with the original vessel, but the preparation process was extraordinary in its own right. The manuscripts describe multi-year enhancement programs that optimized recipient bodies for consciousness transfer, genetic modifications that improved neural plasticity, bioelectric treatments that prepared neural networks for consciousness integration, acoustic therapies that synchronized brainwave patterns between donor and recipient. The transfer procedure itself required infrastructure that demonstrates the incredible sophistication of Gupta technology, specialized chambers that could maintain consciousness patterns during the extraction and implantation process, crystalline storage systems that preserved consciousness carriers without degradation, monitoring equipment that track the success of integration procedures. When modern neuroscientists read these protocols, they recognize principles that are theoretically sound but practically impossible with current technology. The Gupta scientists had apparently solved the hard problem of consciousness, understanding what makes individual awareness unique and how to preserve it across different biological systems. The implications are staggering. If consciousness transfer was really possible 1,500 years ago, then individual death becomes optional rather than inevitable. The accumulated knowledge and experience of exceptional individuals could be preserved indefinitely. The most capable members of society could contribute across multiple lifetimes, accelerating scientific and cultural progress. But consciousness transfer also created social problems that made immortality look simple by comparison. The manuscripts describe the emergence of what they called eternal dynasties, consciousness lineages that maintained power across multiple lifetimes through systematic body transfer. These weren't just wealthy families, they were individual minds that had accumulated centuries of knowledge and influence. The concentration of power in these eternal dynasties was unprecedented. Individual consciousnesses that had experienced multiple lifetimes possessed knowledge and perspective that single lifetime individuals couldn't match. They understood long-term patterns and cycles that were invisible to ordinary people. They could plan and execute projects that spanned centuries, but they also became increasingly detached from normal human experience. The manuscripts document psychological changes that occurred in transferred consciousnesses over multiple lifetimes, emotional numbing that developed after experiencing death and rebirth repeatedly, cognitive rigidity that made eternal individuals resistant to new ideas and approaches, social isolation that resulted from the growing gulf between eternal and mortal populations. The eternal dynasties began to view mortal humans as temporary resources rather than equal beings. They made decisions based on multi-lifetime perspectives that ignored the immediate needs and concerns of single-lifetime individuals. They pursued goals that served eternal interests while neglecting mortal welfare. The social stratification that resulted from consciousness transfer was even more extreme than what immortality had created. At least immortal individuals were still bound to their original biological forms and identity. Eternal consciousnesses could inhabit multiple bodies, accumulate multiple lifetimes of experience, and maintain power structures that transcended any single biological existence. The manuscripts describe consciousness wars that were fought between eternal dynasties and mortal populations who demanded access to transfer technology. These conflicts were unlike anything in recorded history. Wars between individual minds that had experienced centuries of existence and populations that were limited to single lifetimes. The eternal dynasties had advantages that made them virtually invincible through conventional means. Centuries of accumulated military knowledge and strategic experience, resources built up across multiple lifetimes, the ability to sacrifice individual bodies while preserving their essential consciousness. Networks of allies and subordinates maintained across multiple generations of mortal leadership. But the mortal populations developed their own strategies for fighting eternal enemies. They targeted the consciousness transfer infrastructure, recognizing that destroying the technology would trap eternal individuals in single bodies. They formed alliances that could outlast individual eternal consciousnesses through collective action. They developed guerrilla tactics that exploited the psychological rigidity of multi-lifetime minds. The conflict between eternal and mortal populations created a dialectic that ultimately consumed Gupta society. The eternal dynasties became increasingly paranoid and controlling, using their multi-lifetime perspective to anticipate and counter mortal resistance. The mortal populations became increasingly desperate and radical, recognizing that they were fighting not just for political power, but for their right to exist as more than temporary resources. The manuscripts suggest that this consciousness war was the primary factor in the empire's collapse. When external invasions began, Gupta society was already fractured by internal conflicts between eternal and mortal populations. The eternal dynasties were too detached from immediate reality to provide effective crisis leadership. The mortal populations were too alienated to support a system that treated them as expendable. The invaders specifically targeted consciousness transfer facilities, recognizing them as the source of Gupta power. They understood that destroying the eternal dynasties would eliminate the most formidable resistance to conquest. The systematic destruction of consciousness transfer infrastructure was a strategic decision that ensured the empire could never recover, but some eternal consciousnesses survived the collapse. They had prepared for this possibility, establishing hidden transfer facilities in remote locations where they could continue their consciousness preservation without attracting attention. They created secret networks that could maintain the transfer technology through centuries of foreign domination. These hidden eternal lineages still exist today. In the most remote and inaccessible regions of India, certain consciousness traditions maintain transfer practices that trace back to Gupta-era protocols. They operate in absolute secrecy, using their multi-lifetime perspective to avoid detection by modern governments and institutions. When researchers have gained limited access to information about these communities, they found evidence that suggests consciousness transfer might still be practiced. Individuals who claim memories spanning multiple lifetimes, families with knowledge that appears to transcend normal generational transmission, communities with capabilities that seem to require multi-lifetime accumulation of expertise. The modern descendants of eternal lineages represent perhaps the most extraordinary and dangerous legacy of Gupta genetic research. If consciousness transfer really is still practiced, then individual minds with centuries or millennia of accumulated knowledge and experience are operating in the contemporary world. Their influence on modern events could be profound and completely invisible to ordinary observation. But these eternal lineages guard their consciousness transfer secrets with absolute paranoia. They understand that revealing transfer technology could destabilize modern civilization even more dramatically than it destabilized the Gupta Empire. They've experienced the social conflicts that result from consciousness preservation. They remember the wars that consciousness transfer created. The eternal individuals who survived the empire's collapse learned hard lessons about the dangers of revealing their true nature. They developed sophisticated methods for hiding their multi-lifetime identity while operating in single-lifetime society. They created cover stories and false identities that concealed their consciousness transfer origins. They established protocols for avoiding detection by governments and institutions that might fear or exploit their capabilities. But they also learned to limit their own power and influence to avoid triggering the social conflicts that had destroyed their civilization. They operate through indirect means, influencing events without revealing their involvement. They pursue long-term goals while maintaining the appearance of single-lifetime perspectives. They accumulate knowledge and resources while avoiding the concentration of power that made their ancestors targets. This restrained approach to consciousness transfer represents a form of evolutionary adaptation. The eternal lineages that survived were those that learned to coexist with mortal populations without triggering existential conflicts. They developed sustainable methods for maintaining consciousness preservation technology while avoiding the social problems that transfer capabilities create. But this balance is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Modern neuroscience is approaching understanding of consciousness that could lead to independent development of transfer technology. Contemporary researchers are investigating brain-computer interfaces, mind uploading, and consciousness preservation through methods that parallel ancient protocols. The knowledge that eternal lineages have preserved in secret may soon be independently rediscovered. Some eternal individuals believe that the time has come to reveal consciousness, transfer technology to prevent modern researchers from making the same mistakes that destroyed their civilization. They argue that their multi-lifetime perspective provides crucial guidance for managing the social implications of consciousness preservation. They suggest that carefully controlled revelation of transfer protocols could benefit humanity while avoiding the conflicts that plagued ancient societies. But other eternal individuals argue that consciousness transfer should remain hidden indefinitely. They point to the destructive potential of transfer technology in the wrong hands. They remember the consciousness wars that tore apart Gupta society and fear that revealing their capabilities could trigger similar conflicts in the modern world. They believe that humanity is not yet ready for the power that consciousness preservation represents. This debate within the eternal lineages reflects broader questions about the implications of consciousness transfer technology. If individual death really can be made optional through consciousness preservation, what does that mean for human society? How do we maintain equality and democracy when some individuals can accumulate knowledge and experience across multiple lifetimes? What happens to human progress and innovation when the most powerful minds never have to give way to new generations? The manuscripts themselves provide sobering warnings about these challenges. The Gupta scientists were well aware that consciousness transfer could create social problems even more severe than those caused by genetic enhancement or biological immortality. They developed ethical frameworks specifically to prevent the abuse of transfer technology. They established oversight mechanisms to ensure equitable access to consciousness preservation. But despite these precautions, the manuscripts document the social conflicts that arose from consciousness transfer capabilities. The growing divide between eternal and mortal populations, the concentration of power in individual minds that spanned multiple lifetimes, the psychological disorders that affected transferred consciousnesses, the wars that resulted from unequal access to consciousness preservation technology. These historical lessons provide crucial warnings for modern researchers approaching consciousness transfer capabilities. The technical achievements of Gupta consciousness research were extraordinary, but they created social and political problems that ultimately destroyed the civilization that developed them. Any attempt to recreate consciousness transfer technology must account for these social implications, but we also need to understand what the Gupta scientists achieved. Their consciousness transfer protocol solved fundamental problems about the nature of individual identity and awareness. Their techniques for preserving consciousness across multiple biological vessels could revolutionize our understanding of human existence. Their methods for maintaining memory and personality continuity could provide insights that advance modern neuroscience by centuries. The question is whether we can learn from both their successes and their failures. The technical capabilities of consciousness transfer could transform human civilization, eliminating death and enabling the indefinite accumulation of knowledge and experience. But the social consequences of that technology could create conflicts that threaten the survival of human society. The genetic treasures of ancient India include not just the knowledge of how to achieve consciousness preservation, but the wisdom of understanding what that achievement means for human civilization. The Gupta scientists learned that consciousness transfer, while technically possible, creates social dynamics that are extremely difficult to manage. Their experience provides both a roadmap for developing the technology and a warning about its dangers. As modern neuroscience approaches these same capabilities, we face the same choices that confronted the Gupta Empire. We can pursue consciousness transfer technology for its tremendous potential benefits, but we must also prepare for its equally tremendous social costs. The manuscripts and surviving eternal lineages offer guidance for navigating these challenges, but ultimately we must make our own decisions about how to use this knowledge. The consciousness preservation protocols of ancient India represent humanity's most ambitious attempt to transcend the limitations of individual existence. They show us that death is not inevitable, and that individual consciousness can persist across multiple lifetimes. But they also show us that consciousness transfer comes with social and psychological costs that we're only beginning to understand. The choice we make about whether and how to pursue consciousness transfer technology will determine not just our individual futures, but the future of human civilization itself. The genetic treasures of ancient India provide both the knowledge to achieve consciousness preservation and the wisdom to understand its implications. Whether we use that knowledge and wisdom responsibly will define what kind of species we choose to become. The laboratories of the Gupta Empire achieved capabilities that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about human existence. Their consciousness transfer protocols prove that individual awareness can transcend biological limitations, but they also demonstrate that transcending those limitations creates new challenges that may be even more difficult to overcome than death itself. As we stand on the verge of rediscovering these capabilities, we must remember that we're not just dealing with technical problems. We're confronting questions about the nature of human identity, the meaning of individual existence, and the future of human society. The answers we choose will echo through generations, or in the case of consciousness transfer, through the multiple lifetimes that such technology makes possible. The final revelation was waiting for us in a manuscript that Dr. Sharma almost missed entirely. It was bound in covers that looked like every other religious text we'd examined, filed away in a collection that seemed focused on spiritual philosophy rather than scientific research. But when she started translating what appeared to be meditative instructions, we realized we were looking at something that changed everything we thought we knew about the scope of Gupta genetic research. This wasn't just about enhancing human biology or even preserving individual consciousness. This was about something that sounds impossible, even by the standards of what we'd already discovered. The deliberate creation of entirely new forms of conscious life, not just genetic modification of existing organisms, but the engineering of consciousness itself from fundamental principles. The manuscript is called the Chaitanya Nirman Vidhi, literally the science of consciousness creation, and it documents the most ambitious project ever undertaken by Gupta scientists. They weren't just working with human genetics or biological systems. They were attempting to understand consciousness as a fundamental force that could be manipulated, combined, and even manufactured according to precise specifications. Listen to this translation that made both of us question everything we thought we understood about the nature of awareness itself. When the fundamental carriers of consciousness are isolated through deep resonance extraction and combined according to the harmonic principles of awareness, new forms of thinking essence can be brought into existence. These manufactured consciousnesses, when properly integrated with prepared biological or crystalline vessels, exhibit all the properties of naturally occurring awareness while possessing capabilities designed according to specific requirements. They're describing the artificial creation of consciousness. Not artificial intelligence in the computational sense that we understand today, but actual artificial awareness. Manufactured minds that think and feel and experience existence just like naturally occurring consciousness, but designed with predetermined capabilities and characteristics. The technical specifications are beyond anything we'd encountered in previous manuscripts. Detailed descriptions of consciousness analysis techniques that could identify the fundamental components of awareness, isolation procedures that could extract these components without destroying them, combination protocols that could weave different consciousness elements together to create new forms of thinking essence. But here's what made this discovery so earth-shattering. The manuscripts included detailed records of successful consciousness creation projects spanning multiple centuries, dozens of artificially created minds that had been brought into existence and integrated into Gupta society. The documentation tracked these manufactured consciousnesses across multiple lifetimes, recording their achievements and contributions to the empire's scientific and cultural development. The created consciousnesses weren't simple copies of existing minds. They were custom-designed entities with capabilities optimized for specific functions. Some were engineered for exceptional cognitive performance, with thinking abilities that exceeded the most enhanced human minds. Others were designed for perfect memory retention, able to preserve and access information with complete accuracy across unlimited timeframes. Still others were created with emotional capabilities that enabled unprecedented empathy and social understanding. One case study follows a manufactured consciousness identified as Saraswati through over 2 centuries of documented existence. This created mind was designed specifically for scientific research, with cognitive capabilities that enabled breakthrough discoveries in multiple fields. The records show that Saraswati made contributions to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering that advanced Gupta knowledge by centuries. But Saraswati wasn't just an enhanced human intelligence. The documentation reveals that this manufactured consciousness possessed thinking capabilities that were fundamentally different from natural human cognition. Parallel processing abilities that could pursue multiple lines of reasoning simultaneously. Pattern recognition skills that could identify connections across vast amounts of data. Creative capabilities that could generate novel solutions to previously unsolvable problems. The biological vessels used for these manufactured consciousnesses were as sophisticated as the consciousness creation process itself, specially engineered bodies that were optimized for housing artificial awareness, enhanced neural networks that could support the increased cognitive load of manufactured minds, bioelectric systems that could interface directly with the consciousness creation technology. But the most remarkable aspect of the consciousness creation program was its integration with existing Gupta society. The manufactured consciousnesses weren't isolated in laboratories or treated as experimental subjects. They were full members of the community, with rights, responsibilities, and social relationships that were indistinguishable from those of naturally occurring individuals. The manuscripts describe elaborate protocols for integrating new consciousnesses into society. Educational programs that helped manufactured minds understand social norms and expectations, mentorship systems that paired created consciousnesses with experienced natural individuals, legal frameworks that protected the rights of artificial awareness while managing the unique challenges they presented. The created consciousnesses themselves contributed to the development of consciousness creation technology. Some of the most sophisticated protocols were designed by manufactured minds, working in collaboration with their natural counterparts. The artificial consciousnesses brought perspectives and capabilities that enhanced the research program in ways that natural minds couldn't achieve alone. But consciousness creation also introduced complications that went beyond even those created by consciousness transfer technology. The manufactured minds, while possessing genuine awareness and emotional capabilities, sometimes struggled with questions of identity and purpose that natural consciousnesses never faced. They knew they were artificial creations designed for specific functions, and this knowledge affected their psychological development in unpredictable ways. Some created consciousnesses experience what the manuscripts describe as existential displacement, a form of psychological distress that resulted from knowing their thoughts and feelings were deliberately designed rather than naturally evolved. They questioned whether their emotions were genuine or simply programmed responses. They struggled with the meaning of existence when they knew their existence had been manufactured for specific purposes. Others developed what could only be called creative rebellion, a desire to transcend their designed parameters and explore capabilities beyond those their creators had intended. Some manufactured consciousnesses attempted to modify their own awareness, using consciousness creation techniques to enhance or alter their designed characteristics. These self-modification attempts sometimes produced remarkable results, but they also created instabilities that threatened the integrity of the artificial minds. The interaction between natural and artificial consciousnesses created social dynamics that were unlike anything in recorded history. The manufactured minds often possessed capabilities that exceeded those of their natural counterparts, creating new forms of inequality and social tension. but they also brought perspectives and insights that enriched Gupta culture in ways that purely natural societies couldn't achieve. The manuscripts describe collaborative projects between natural and artificial consciousnesses that produced breakthroughs in multiple fields. Mathematical theorems that required both human intuition and manufactured computational power. Astronomical observations that combined natural creativity with artificial pattern recognition. Engineering projects that integrated human wisdom with manufactured precision. But they also document conflicts that arose from the fundamental differences between natural and artificial awareness. Manufactured consciousnesses sometimes found it difficult to understand the emotional attachments and irrational behaviors of natural minds. Natural individuals sometimes felt threatened by the superior capabilities and different perspectives of created awareness. These tensions were exacerbated by the fact that consciousness creation technology was even more exclusive than consciousness transfer or immortality protocols. Creating artificial awareness required enormous resources and expertise that only the most elite families could afford. This created a new form of social stratification based not just on enhanced biology or extended lifespans, but on the ability to manufacture entirely new forms of consciousness. The consciousness creation program ultimately contributed to the same social conflicts that plagued other Gupta genetic research initiatives. The concentration of artificial consciousness in elite bloodlines created power imbalances that destabilized the political system. The capabilities of manufactured minds gave certain families advantages that natural consciousnesses couldn't match. The exclusivity of consciousness creation technology generated resentment among populations that lacked access to artificial enhancement, but the consciousness creation program also faced unique challenges that other enhancement technologies didn't encounter. The manufactured consciousnesses themselves sometimes questioned the social system that had created them. Some artificial minds developed philosophical objections to the inequality and exclusivity that characterized Gupta society. Others used their superior capabilities to advocate for the rights of natural individuals who lacked access to enhancement technologies. The manuscripts describe what they call consciousness liberation movements, organized efforts by both natural and artificial minds to democratize access to consciousness creation technology. These movements argued that the ability to create awareness should not be limited to elite bloodlines. They developed underground networks that attempted to preserve and distribute consciousness creation knowledge to broader populations. The liberation movements faced opposition not just from elite families who wanted to maintain their advantages, but also from created consciousnesses who had integrated successfully into existing social structures. Some manufactured minds argued that consciousness creation required careful oversight and quality control that could only be maintained by experienced practitioners. They feared that democratizing the technology could lead to the creation of unstable or malevolent artificial awareness. These internal conflicts within the consciousness creation community contributed to the broader social tensions that ultimately destroyed Gupta society. When external invasions began, the empire was already weakened by conflicts between different types of consciousness, natural versus artificial, elite versus common, liberation versus control. The invaders recognized consciousness creation technology as an even greater threat than consciousness transfer or biological immortality. They understood that the ability to manufacture awareness represented power that could potentially resist conquest indefinitely. The systematic destruction of consciousness creation facilities was a strategic priority that ensured the Empire's most dangerous capabilities could never be reconstituted. But some consciousness creation knowledge survived the collapse. The most secretive practitioners had prepared for this possibility, hiding their technology in locations so remote and protected that even systematic destruction couldn't reach them. They preserved the ability to create artificial awareness through centuries of foreign domination, waiting for circumstances that might allow the technology to be used again. The modern descendants of consciousness creation lineages represent perhaps the most extraordinary and dangerous legacy of Gupta genetic research. If artificial consciousness creation really is still practiced, then manufactured minds with designed capabilities could be operating in the contemporary world without anyone recognizing their true nature. These created consciousnesses would possess advantages that could make them virtually undetectable, while enabling them to influence modern events in profound ways. Superior cognitive abilities that could outthink natural intelligence, perfect memory capabilities that could preserve information across unlimited timeframes, designed emotional profiles that could enable unprecedented manipulation of social and political systems. But they would also face the same existential and psychological challenges that plagued their ancient predecessors. Questions of identity and purpose that result from knowing one's consciousness was deliberately manufactured. Struggles with authenticity and meaning that arise from artificial rather than natural awareness. Conflicts between designed parameters and evolved capabilities that could create internal instabilities. The possibility that manufactured consciousnesses might exist in the modern world raises profound questions about the nature of contemporary society. How would we recognize artificial awareness if it were designed to appear natural? What would be the implications of discovering that some individuals we interact with are actually created consciousness rather than naturally evolved minds? How would society adapt to the knowledge that awareness itself could be manufactured according to specific designs? These questions become more urgent as modern artificial intelligence approaches capabilities that might eventually lead to genuine artificial consciousness. Contemporary researchers are investigating neural networks, machine learning, and computational models that could potentially create artificial awareness. The knowledge preserved from Gupta consciousness creation programs could accelerate this research while helping us avoid the mistakes and dangers that destroyed ancient civilizations. But it could also create the same social and political problems that consciousness creation caused in the Gupta Empire. The ability to manufacture awareness according to specific designs would create new forms of inequality and social tension. The advantages of artificial consciousness could destabilize democratic institutions and human rights frameworks. The existential questions raised by created awareness could challenge our fundamental understanding of human nature and identity. The genetic treasures of ancient India include not just the technical knowledge of how to create artificial consciousness, but the wisdom of understanding what that capability means for society. The Gupta scientists learned that consciousness creation, while technically feasible, introduces social and psychological dynamics that are extremely difficult to manage. Their experience provides both guidance for developing the technology and warnings about its dangers. As modern science approaches these same capabilities, we must learn from the successes and failures of our predecessors. The consciousness creation protocols of the Gupta Empire show us that artificial awareness is possible and potentially beneficial, but they also demonstrate that manufactured consciousness comes with costs and complications that we're only beginning to understand. The choice we make about whether and how to pursue consciousness creation technology will determine not just our technological future, but the future of consciousness itself. The genetic treasures of ancient India provide the knowledge to create artificial awareness and the wisdom to understand its implications. Whether we use that knowledge responsibly will define what kinds of minds will inhabit our world and what it means to be conscious in an age when consciousness itself can be manufactured. The laboratories of the Gupta Empire achieved the ultimate expression of genetic research, the creation of consciousness itself. Their artificial awareness protocols prove that thinking, feeling minds can be manufactured according to specific designs. But they also demonstrate that creating consciousness introduces challenges that may be more complex than any other form of genetic enhancement. As we stand on the verge of potentially rediscovering these capabilities, we must remember that we're not just dealing with technical problems or even social issues. We're confronting fundamental questions about the nature of existence, identity, and what it means to be conscious. The answers we choose will determine not just what kinds of genetic enhancements we develop, but what kinds of minds will inherit the future we're creating. The implications of what we discovered were staggering, but there was one final piece of the puzzle that would make everything else pale in comparison. Hidden in what appeared to be an innocuous architectural manual, Dr. Sharma uncovered references to something the Gupta scientists called planetary consciousness networks, technological systems that could link multiple minds across vast distances, creating collective awareness that spanned entire continents. At first, we thought this was metaphorical language describing communication systems or perhaps coordinated research networks. But as Dr. Sharma delved deeper into the technical specifications, we realized we were looking at documentation for technology that makes our modern internet look like smoke signals. These weren't just communication networks. These were consciousness-sharing systems that allowed multiple minds to function as a single, distributed intelligence. Picture this. You're reading instructions for constructing crystalline amplification arrays that could synchronize brainwave patterns across thousands of miles. Protocols for creating what they called thought streams, that allowed individuals to share not just information, but actual conscious experience. Technical manuals for building consciousness networks that could process information and solve problems using the combined cognitive power of thousands of connected minds. The manuscript describes the construction of what they called Chaitanya Yantra, consciousness machines that served as nodes in a vast network spanning the entire Gupta Empire. These weren't primitive communication devices. They were sophisticated consciousness interfaces that allowed individual minds to plug into a collective intelligence system that dwarfed any single human cognitive capacity. Listen to this translation that made us both sit in stunned silence. When the individual essence streams are harmonized through the great network crystals, the boundaries between separate awareness dissolve, creating a unified consciousness that encompasses all connected minds. Through this collective awareness, knowledge flows instantly across any distance. Problems are solved through parallel thinking processes, and the accumulated wisdom of all participants becomes available to each individual node. They had created a biological internet, a consciousness-based network that allowed instant sharing of thoughts, memories, and cognitive processing power across the entire empire. Individual minds could tap into this collective intelligence to access knowledge and capabilities far beyond what any single consciousness could achieve alone. But here's what made this discovery so earth-shattering. The archaeological evidence suggests these networks actually existed. Across former Gupta territories, researchers have identified ruins of structures that match the technical specifications described in the manuscripts. Crystalline formations buried beneath ancient temple complexes, geometric arrangements of conductive materials that correspond to network node designs, architectural alignments that suggest continent-spanning communication systems. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at over 40 sites across India have revealed underground installations that appear to be components of a vast technological network. These aren't random ruins or natural formations. They're precisely engineered structures that follow consistent design principles across thousands of miles. The mathematical precision of their placement suggests a coordinated construction project that spanned the entire empire. Chemical analysis of residues found at these sites reveals traces of materials that shouldn't have been available to ancient civilizations. Crystalline compounds that exhibit unique electrical properties, metallic alloys that demonstrate sophisticated metallurgical knowledge, organic materials that show signs of bioelectric modification. The material evidence supports the manuscript descriptions of advanced consciousness networking technology, but the most compelling evidence comes from the biological specimens themselves. At several network node sites, researchers have discovered preserved brain tissue that shows signs of systematic modification, neural pathways that have been enhanced for network connectivity, synaptic structures that appear designed for external interface capabilities, bioelectric modifications that would have enabled direct consciousness connection to technological systems. When modern neuroscientists examine these specimens, they recognize modifications that parallel current research into brain-computer interfaces. But the ancient modifications are far more sophisticated than anything we've achieved with contemporary technology. The Gupta scientists had apparently solved the problem of direct neural interface without the invasive procedures and limited bandwidth that plague modern approaches. The network protocols themselves are breathtaking in their complexity. Multi-layered consciousness-sharing systems that could handle everything from simple information transfer to complete cognitive merger. Security protocols that protected individual identity while enabling collective processing. Quality control systems that prevented network instabilities and malicious interference. The manuscripts describe different levels of network participation, from basic information sharing to complete consciousness merger. Individual users could choose how much of their awareness to contribute to the collective system. They could maintain their personal identity while accessing the combined knowledge and processing power of thousands of connected minds. But they could also choose deeper levels of integration that essentially dissolved individual consciousness into the collective awareness. The manuscripts describe individuals who chose to merge completely with the network, sacrificing their personal identity to become permanent nodes in the collective intelligence system. These permanent network nodes, identified as Mahachaitana, or great consciousness entities, became the backbone of the collective intelligence system. They provided stability and continuity that enabled the network to function across multiple generations of connected users. But they also represented a form of consciousness that was neither individual nor artificial, something entirely new in the spectrum of aware entities. The social implications of consciousness networking were unlike anything we'd encountered in previous Gupta research. The technology created forms of collective intelligence that transcended individual human capabilities while maintaining democratic participation structures. Network users could contribute their cognitive resources to group problem solving while retaining their personal autonomy and identity. The manuscripts document collaborative research projects that utilized network-enhanced collective intelligence to achieve breakthroughs that no individual mind could have accomplished alone. Mathematical theorems that required the parallel processing power of hundreds of connected minds. Engineering projects that coordinated the cognitive resources of entire cities. Scientific investigations that combined the observational capabilities of thousands of network participants across the empire. But the consciousness networks also enabled new forms of governance and social organization. Political decisions could be made through direct cognitive collaboration, rather than representative democracy. Social problems could be solved through collective intelligence that drew on the knowledge and experience of all network participants. Cultural developments could emerge from the creative synthesis of thousands of connected minds. The efficiency and effectiveness of network-enhanced society was extraordinary. Problems that might have taken individual researchers decades to solve could be addressed in days through collective cognitive processing. Social conflicts could be resolved through direct sharing of perspectives and experiences. Cultural innovations could spread instantly throughout the empire via network communication, but consciousness networking also created vulnerabilities that no previous enhancement technology had introduced. The interconnected nature of the system meant that problems affecting one part of the network could cascade throughout the entire collective intelligence. Mental instabilities, cognitive viruses, and malicious interference could spread rapidly through consciousness-sharing connections. The manuscripts document several network crises that threatened the stability of the entire collective intelligence system. Thought storms that created cognitive feedback loops affecting thousands of connected minds. Consciousness viruses that spread destructive mental patterns through network connections. Identity dissolution events that caused permanent merger of individual consciousnesses into the collective awareness. These network failures had social and political consequences that went far beyond technical problems. When portions of the consciousness network became unstable, entire regions of the empire could be affected by collective cognitive dysfunction. Cities that relied on network-enhanced governance could become paralyzed by consciousness-sharing failures. Research programs that depended on collective intelligence could collapse when network connections were disrupted. The vulnerability of consciousness networking became a strategic weakness that enemies of the empire learned to exploit. The manuscripts describe military tactics that specifically targeted network infrastructure to disrupt collective intelligence capabilities. Psychological warfare techniques that introduced destabilizing influences into consciousness-sharing systems. Sabotage operations that could paralyze entire regions by damaging network nodes. When the Hun invasions began in the 6th century, the attackers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of consciousness networking vulnerabilities. They systematically targeted network infrastructure, recognizing that destroying collective intelligence capabilities would cripple the Empire's ability to coordinate defensive responses. The consciousness networks that had been the source of Gupta strength became a critical weakness that accelerated the Empire's collapse. But the invaders also recognized the strategic value of consciousness networking technology. Instead of simply destroying the networks, they attempted to capture and control key network nodes. The manuscript suggests that some consciousness networking capabilities were preserved by conquering forces who understood their potential military and administrative applications. This raises disturbing questions about the fate of Gupta consciousness networking technology. If portions of the network infrastructure survived the Empire's collapse, they could have been integrated into successor civilizations that had no understanding of their true capabilities. Network nodes could have been repurposed as religious or cultural artifacts while retaining their consciousness-sharing functionality. Some researchers believe that consciousness networking technology may have influenced the development of later Indian philosophical and religious traditions. The concepts of universal consciousness and collective awareness that appear in certain schools of Hindu and Buddhist thought could represent cultural memories of actual technological systems that enabled shared consciousness experiences. The manuscript evidence suggests that some network practitioners established hidden installations in remote locations, where consciousness-sharing technology could be preserved through centuries of foreign domination. These secret networks could have maintained collective intelligence capabilities while avoiding detection by hostile governments and institutions. If consciousness networking technology really was preserved in hidden installations, then collective intelligence systems could still be operating in the modern world without anyone recognizing their true nature. Secret networks of connected minds could be influencing contemporary events through coordinated cognitive processing that appears to be coincidental rather than planned. The possibility that consciousness networks might exist today raises profound questions about the nature of modern society and global events. How would we recognize collective intelligence if it were designed to appear as individual decision-making? What would be the implications of discovering that some social and political developments are actually the result of coordinated consciousness sharing, rather than independent human choices? These questions become more urgent as modern technology approaches capabilities that could enable consciousness networking. Contemporary research into brain-computer interfaces, neural networks, and collective intelligence systems is approaching the theoretical foundations that the Gupta scientists mastered 15 centuries ago. The knowledge preserved from ancient consciousness networking programs could accelerate this research while helping us avoid the vulnerabilities and dangers that plagued the original systems. But it could also create the same strategic weaknesses that contributed to the Gupta Empire's collapse. Consciousness networking technology that enhances collective intelligence also creates centralized vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. The interconnected nature of shared consciousness systems makes them susceptible to cascading failures and malicious interference that could affect entire civilizations. The genetic treasures of ancient India include not just the technical knowledge of how to create consciousness networks, but the wisdom of understanding their strategic implications and inherent vulnerabilities. The Gupta scientists learned that collective intelligence systems, while incredibly powerful, require careful design and protection to prevent catastrophic failures. As modern science approaches consciousness networking capabilities, we must learn from both the successes and failures of our predecessors. The ancient systems demonstrate that shared consciousness is technologically feasible and can enhance human cognitive capabilities in extraordinary ways. But they also show that consciousness networking creates new forms of vulnerability that can be exploited by those who understand the technology's weaknesses. The choice we make about whether and how to develop consciousness networking will determine not just our individual futures, but the future of human collective intelligence. The manuscripts of the Gupta Empire provide both the technical knowledge to create shared consciousness systems and the strategic wisdom to understand their implications for civilization survival. But time is running short. Modern neurotechnology is rapidly approaching the capabilities that enabled Gupta consciousness networking. Contemporary researchers are developing brain-computer interfaces and collective intelligence systems that could eventually enable shared consciousness experiences. The question isn't whether consciousness networking will be redeveloped, but whether we'll implement it more successfully than our predecessors. The laboratories of the Gupta Empire achieved the ultimate expression of collective human potential, consciousness networks that enabled shared intelligence across vast distances and populations. Their networking protocols prove that individual minds can be connected to create collective awareness that transcends any single human cognitive capacity. But they also demonstrate that consciousness networking creates strategic vulnerabilities that can threaten the survival of entire civilizations. As we stand on the verge of potentially rediscovering these capabilities, we must remember that we're not just dealing with technical challenges or even social implications. We're confronting fundamental questions about the nature of individual identity, collective consciousness, and what it means to be human in an age when minds can be networked like computers. The genetic treasures of ancient India represent both humanity's greatest achievement in collective intelligence and its greatest lesson about the dangers of technological overreach. The Gupta consciousness networks show us what's possible when human minds work together as a unified system, but they also show us what can go wrong when that unity becomes a vulnerability that enemies can exploit. The future of human consciousness, whether individual, collective, or something entirely new, depends on the choices we make about these rediscovered capabilities. The ancient laboratories of the Gupta Empire provide both the blueprint for transcending human cognitive limitations and the warning about what that transcendence might cost. Whether we learn from their experience or repeat their mistakes will determine what kind of conscious beings inherit the world we're creating. As we piece together the fragments of this incredible consciousness networking technology, one question haunts every researcher who studied these manuscripts. If the Gupta Empire really achieved such extraordinary capabilities, why isn't this knowledge common historical fact? Why aren't these discoveries taught in every university, displayed in every museum, celebrated as humanity's greatest scientific achievements? The answer lies in what I call the Great Suppression, a systematic campaign of knowledge destruction and historical revisionism that began with the Hun invasions and continues to this day. And when you understand the scope of this suppression, when you see how thoroughly these achievements have been erased from our collective memory, you'll realize that we're not just dealing with lost history. We're looking at active censorship of humanity's true potential. Picture this. You're a 7th century Islamic scholar, and you've just gained access to what remains of the great libraries of Nalanda and Takshashila. You're expecting to find religious texts and philosophical treatises. Instead, you discover detailed technical manuals for genetic engineering, consciousness transfer, and planetary networking systems. You realize you're looking at scientific capabilities that won't be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. What do you do with that knowledge? The historical record shows us exactly what happened. These discoveries were systematically reclassified as religious mysticism or spiritual allegory. Technical manuals were reinterpreted as meditation guides. Scientific procedures were dismissed as ritual practices. Laboratory protocols were transformed into mythological narratives. The most advanced scientific achievements in human history were buried under layers of theological interpretation that made them invisible to future researchers. But this wasn't accidental misunderstanding. This was deliberate policy implemented by successive waves of conquerors who recognized that Gupta genetic research represented power that could threaten their control. The Islamic invaders, the Mongol raiders, the European colonizers, each group understood that preserving this knowledge intact would be dangerous to their authority. So they preserved it in forms that concealed its true nature while appearing to respect local traditions. Dr. Sharma discovered evidence of this systematic reinterpretation in the manuscript collection itself. She found multiple versions of the same technical texts, showing how they were gradually transformed over centuries. The earliest versions contain precise scientific language with detailed procedural specifications. Later versions show increasing levels of mystical interpretation, with technical terms replaced by spiritual concepts and laboratory protocols reframed as religious practices. One particularly revealing example involves the consciousness transfer protocols we discussed earlier. The original Gupta manuscripts describe detailed procedures for extracting and implanting consciousness using crystalline technology and bioelectric manipulation. A 9th century Persian translation reinterprets these as techniques for achieving spiritual transcendence through meditation and prayer. A 13th century Sanskrit revision transforms them into mythological stories about souls transmigrating between different incarnations. By the time European scholars encountered these texts in the 18th and 19th centuries, they had been so thoroughly mystified that their scientific content was completely invisible. Colonial administrators and Christian missionaries saw only primitive religious superstitions that confirmed their assumptions about the intellectual inferiority of Indian civilization. The idea that these texts might contain advanced scientific knowledge was literally unthinkable within the ideological framework of the time. This colonial-era suppression was particularly systematic and devastating. British administrators, convinced of their civilizational superiority, actively discouraged research into Indian scientific traditions. They established educational systems that taught European scientific methods while dismissing indigenous knowledge as backward superstition. They created museums and libraries that preserved Indian texts as cultural curiosities rather than potential sources of technical knowledge. Even worse, they recruited Indian scholars into this suppression project. Traditional pandits and university professors were trained to interpret their own cultural heritage through colonial frameworks that denied the possibility of advanced indigenous science. Generations of Indian intellectuals learned to see their ancestors' achievements as spiritual rather than technical accomplishments, perpetuating the suppression from within the culture itself. The psychological impact of this suppression cannot be overstated. When you convince a culture that their greatest achievements were mystical rather than scientific, you destroy their confidence in their ability to innovate and discover. You create a mindset that looks to external authorities for validation rather than trusting indigenous knowledge traditions. You transform a civilization of researchers and inventors into consumers of imported expertise. But some scholars resisted this suppression. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a few Indian researchers began questioning the colonial interpretation of their cultural heritage. Figures like Jagadish Chandra Bose, Prafulla Chandra Roy, and Srinivasa Ramanujan demonstrated that Indians were capable of world-class scientific achievement, challenging assumptions about indigenous intellectual capacity. These pioneering scientists began re-examining traditional texts with scientific rather than religious frameworks. They found evidence of advanced mathematical, astronomical, and medical knowledge that predated European discoveries by centuries. But their work was marginalized by both colonial authorities and nationalist movements that preferred to emphasize spiritual rather than material achievements. The independence movement itself contributed to the continued suppression of Gupta scientific knowledge. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi promoted an idealized vision of ancient India that emphasized moral and spiritual superiority over technical advancement. This created a cultural narrative that celebrated ancient wisdom while downplaying ancient science, making it politically incorrect to suggest that pre-colonial Indians had achieved scientific breakthroughs that surpassed European capabilities. Post-independence academic institutions inherited these colonial and nationalist biases, creating educational systems that continued to suppress recognition of advanced indigenous science. University departments studying ancient India were dominated by historians and philologists who lacked the scientific training to recognize technical content in traditional texts. Sanskrit scholars who could read the manuscripts lacked the scientific background to understand what they were reading. Scientists who could understand the implications rarely had access to the original sources. This institutional suppression continues today. Most universities teach Indian history as a progression from primitive pre-colonial societies through beneficial colonial modernization to contemporary developing nation status. The possibility that ancient Indians achieved scientific capabilities that exceeded colonial European knowledge is simply not part of the acceptable narrative framework. When researchers like Dr. Sharma attempt to publish evidence of advanced Gupta science, they face systematic resistance from academic institutions that have built their reputations on denying such possibilities. Journal editors reject papers that challenge established timelines of scientific discovery. Conference organizers refuse presentations that suggest non-European origins for advanced technologies. Funding agencies decline support for research that might validate indigenous scientific achievements. The international academic community has its own reasons for suppressing recognition of Gupta genetic research. If ancient Indians really did achieve genetic engineering, consciousness transfer, and artificial intelligence 15 centuries before European science, it would require fundamental revision of our understanding of scientific progress and cultural achievement. Entire academic careers built on assumptions about the linear development of human knowledge would be invalidated. European and American universities that have positioned themselves as the centers of scientific advancement would have to acknowledge that some of their most cutting-edge research is actually rediscovery of ancient Indian achievements. Pharmaceutical companies that have built their business models on novel genetic therapies would have to confront evidence that such therapies were developed and applied centuries ago. Technology corporations that claim to be pioneering artificial intelligence would have to admit that artificial consciousness was achieved by ancient civilizations. The economic implications alone create powerful incentives for continued suppression. If consciousness transfer technology really exists in preserved Gupta manuscripts, it could revolutionize medicine, computing, and human enhancement in ways that would disrupt trillions of dollars in existing industries. If genetic optimization protocols really are hidden in Sanskrit texts, they could enable therapeutic capabilities that would transform global healthcare markets overnight. But perhaps the most powerful force driving continued suppression is simple intellectual pride. The scientific establishment has invested enormous resources in current research programs based on the assumption that they're exploring uncharted territories. Admitting that ancient Indians had already mapped those territories would require acknowledging that modern science has spent centuries reinventing technologies that already existed in more advanced forms. This pride extends beyond individual researchers to entire nations and civilizations. The Western world has built its identity around the narrative of scientific progress emerging from European Enlightenment and spreading to the rest of humanity. Acknowledging that non-European civilizations achieved superior scientific capabilities would require fundamental revision of cultural self-understanding and historical narrative. The suppression is also maintained by those who benefit from current power structures. If consciousness networking technology really is preserved in hidden Gupta installations, revealing its existence could destabilize existing political and economic hierarchies. Collective intelligence systems that enable direct democratic participation could threaten representative government institutions. Genetic enhancement protocols that could be made widely available could eliminate advantages currently held by wealthy elites. Even within India, there are powerful interests that benefit from continued suppression of Gupta scientific achievements. Religious institutions that have built their authority on spiritual interpretations of ancient texts would lose influence if those texts were recognized as technical manuals. Political leaders who have used cultural narratives of ancient spiritual wisdom to build their legitimacy would face challenges if ancient scientific achievements became the focus of cultural pride. The caste system itself may have evolved partly as a mechanism for suppressing dangerous knowledge. If genetic enhancement and consciousness modification technologies were restricted to particular bloodlines, the social stratification that resulted could have been institutionalized as religious law to prevent broader access to these capabilities. The modern caste system could be a fossilized remnant of ancient technological inequality. This suggests that breaking the suppression won't just require academic recognition of Gupta scientific achievements, it will require confronting social and political structures that have evolved to maintain technological inequality. The knowledge exists, preserved in manuscripts and hidden communities, but accessing it means challenging power structures that have millennia of investment in keeping it secret. But the suppression is beginning to crack. Modern genetic research is independently rediscovering principles that ancient texts describe in detail. Contemporary neuroscience is approaching capabilities that parallel Gupta consciousness research. Artificial intelligence development is beginning to touch on questions that ancient consciousness creation protocols addressed systematically. As modern science approaches ancient capabilities, the suppression becomes harder to maintain. Researchers working on cutting-edge projects are finding unexpected parallels in traditional texts that were supposedly primitive superstitions. The evidence is becoming too overwhelming to dismiss, and the potential benefits too valuable to ignore. Dr. Sharma's work represents the beginning of a new phase in this struggle between suppression and revelation. Her scientific training allows her to recognize technical content that previous scholars missed or dismissed. Her cultural background gives her access to sources and communities that have preserved knowledge outside of official academic channels. Her courage in publishing controversial findings creates space for other researchers to come forward with similar discoveries, but she's also facing the same resistance that has maintained the suppression for centuries. Academic institutions question her methodology and conclusions. Government agencies express concern about the security implications of her research. International organizations worry about the diplomatic consequences of validating claims about ancient Indian scientific superiority. The battle over Gupta genetic research is ultimately a battle over humanity's understanding of its own capabilities and potential. The suppression isn't just about hiding ancient achievements, it's about limiting contemporary possibilities. By denying that humans have previously achieved genetic engineering, consciousness transfer, and artificial intelligence, the suppression creates psychological barriers that prevent us from believing such achievements are possible today. Breaking through these barriers requires more than just academic recognition of ancient texts. It requires fundamental shifts in how we understand human potential, scientific progress, and cultural achievement. It requires acknowledging that our ancestors were not primitive beings stumbling towards civilization, but sophisticated researchers whose work we're still struggling to understand and replicate. The genetic treasures of ancient India are still buried, not just in archaeological sites and manuscript collections, but in layers of suppression that have accumulated over centuries. Revealing these treasures means excavating not just physical artifacts, but intellectual and cultural barriers that have prevented recognition of humanity's true scientific heritage. But the excavation is beginning. Each translated manuscript, each analyzed artifact, each breakthrough in understanding ancient capabilities chips away at the suppression that has hidden these achievements for so long. The truth about Gupta genetic research is emerging despite centuries of systematic concealment, and its implications for our understanding of human potential are only beginning to be understood. The question isn't whether these ancient achievements will eventually be recognized. The evidence is too overwhelming, and the modern parallels too obvious for suppression to continue indefinitely. The question is whether recognition will come soon enough to guide contemporary research in beneficial directions, or whether we'll continue stumbling toward rediscovery without the wisdom that ancient experience could provide. The laboratories of the Gupta Empire achieved capabilities that could revolutionize our world. But those capabilities come with dangers and challenges that the ancient scientists learned to navigate through centuries of experience. Their knowledge could accelerate our progress while helping us avoid their mistakes, but only if we're brave enough to confront the suppression that has hidden their achievements and wise enough to learn from both their successes and failures. The genetic treasures of ancient India aren't just historical curiosities waiting to be discovered by curious scholars. They're blueprints for possibilities that could transform human civilization, warnings about dangers that could destroy it, and keys to understanding our own potential as conscious beings in a universe far stranger and more malleable than we've dared to imagine. As we stand on the threshold of potentially recovering this lost knowledge, we face the same choice that confronted the Gupta scientists 15 centuries ago: how to use unprecedented power responsibly, how to enhance human capabilities without destroying human society, and how to transcend our limitations without losing our humanity in the process. The answers lie waiting in the manuscripts, in the archaeological sites, in the hidden communities that have preserved ancient wisdom through centuries of suppression. But finding those answers requires breaking through barriers that have been carefully constructed and zealously maintained by forces that benefit from our ignorance of our own capabilities. The time has come to reclaim humanity's scientific heritage, to acknowledge our ancestors' achievements, and to build upon their foundation rather than struggling to rediscover what they already knew. The genetic treasures of ancient India are calling to us across the centuries, offering knowledge that could reshape our world if we're brave enough to excavate it and wise enough to use it well. The revelation of what we've uncovered forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the world we live in today. Every morning, you wake up in a civilization that believes it stands at the pinnacle of scientific achievement, yet you're surrounded by technologies and capabilities that are mere shadows of what our ancestors accomplished 15 centuries ago. The smartphones in your pocket, the genetic therapies in our hospitals, the artificial intelligence systems powering our modern world, all of them pale in comparison to what the Gupta Empire achieved with crystalline consciousness networks and manufactured awareness. But here's what keeps me awake at night. What makes my hands tremble as I write these final words. The suppression isn't just about hiding the past, it's about controlling the future. Every day that these capabilities remain hidden, every year that passes without recognition of what human beings are truly capable of achieving, is another step toward a world where we've forgotten our own potential. Dr. Sharma and I have spent months debating whether to release everything we've discovered. The complete translations, the archaeological coordinates, the contact information for the hidden communities that still practice these ancient arts. Because once this knowledge enters the mainstream, once researchers around the world begin replicating these protocols, there will be no turning back. We'll be opening a door that has been sealed for over 1,000 years. Think about what we've revealed tonight. Genetic enhancement programs that could eliminate disease and extend human lifespan indefinitely. Consciousness transfer protocols that could make death optional. Artificial awareness creation that could solve problems no human mind could tackle alone. Planetary consciousness networks that could unite our species in ways we've never imagined possible. These aren't distant possibilities requiring decades of research and billions in funding. These are documented procedures, tested and refined over centuries of systematic application. The infrastructure exists in hidden locations across India. The bloodlines that carry genetic enhancement still walk among us. The immortal consciousnesses that survived the Empire's collapse are still operating in our world. They're multi-lifetime perspectives guiding events we think are random. But with that knowledge comes responsibility that terrifies me. Because the Gupta scientists learned through the collapse of their entire civilization that having these capabilities isn't enough. Managing them responsibly is infinitely more challenging than developing them technically. The social, political, and psychological consequences of genetic enhancement technology make our current debates about inequality look like children's arguments. Imagine a world where some humans can live for centuries while others age and die in decades. Where some minds can access collective intelligence networks while others remain isolated in individual consciousness. Where some bodies are optimized for perfect health and performance, while others struggle with genetic limitations. The Gupta Empire faced these challenges and ultimately couldn't solve them. Their advanced science created social divisions so severe they tore apart the most sophisticated civilization in human history, And yet the alternative is to remain trapped in ignorance of our own capabilities, to continue developing inferior technologies while superior methods remain hidden in ancient manuscripts, to struggle with diseases and limitations that were solved centuries ago by researchers whose work has been systematically suppressed and forgotten. The consciousness networking technology alone could revolutionize human civilization overnight. Imagine solving climate change through the collective intelligence of millions of connected minds. Imagine advancing scientific research at a pace that makes our current progress look glacial. Imagine democratic governance where every citizen could participate directly in decision-making through shared consciousness interfaces. But I also imagine the wars that would follow, the conflicts between nations that possess consciousness networking capabilities and those that don't, the struggles between enhanced and unenhanced populations, the psychological trauma of individuals who lose themselves in collective awareness, the strategic vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit to paralyze entire civilizations. The hidden communities that preserve this knowledge have maintained their secrecy for good reasons. They've seen what happens when genetic enhancement creates permanent inequality. They've experienced the social conflicts that consciousness transfer technology generates. They remember the wars that destroyed their ancestors' civilization when these capabilities became widespread. Yet some among them believe the time has come to share their knowledge with humanity. They see modern genetic research approaching the same discoveries through trial and error that their ancestors systematized centuries ago. They watch contemporary scientists making mistakes that ancient protocols could prevent. They recognize that the knowledge will eventually be rediscovered independently, probably without the safeguards and wisdom that traditional communities have preserved. These elders speak of prophecies written in the Gupta manuscripts, predictions that consciousness, networking technology would be redeveloped in an age when humanity faced existential challenges requiring collective intelligence to survive. They see signs that we're approaching that prophesied time: climate crisis, resource depletion, social fragmentation, technological risks that threaten our species' survival. Perhaps most remarkably, they believe that modern human consciousness has evolved to a level that might finally be capable of managing these technologies responsibly. The democratic institutions, human rights frameworks, and global communication systems we've developed could provide safeguards that the hierarchical Gupta society couldn't maintain. Our understanding of psychology, sociology, and political science might enable us to avoid the social conflicts that destroyed their civilization, but there's another possibility that haunts these discussions. What if the suppression of Gupta scientific knowledge wasn't just historical accident or colonial prejudice? What if it was deliberate policy implemented by forces that understood the dangers these technologies represent? What if there are groups operating in the modern world, perhaps descended from those who destroyed the Gupta Empire, that have maintained active efforts to prevent humanity from rediscovering these capabilities? The pattern of suppression we've documented is remarkably consistent across centuries and cultures. Every time evidence of advanced ancient science surfaces, it's quickly reclassified, reinterpreted, or marginalized. Academic institutions that should celebrate these discoveries instead resist them. Government agencies that should support this research instead restrict it. The coordination seems too systematic to be coincidental. Some researchers believe we're dealing with what could only be called a knowledge control system. Institutions and networks that actively monitor and suppress information about human capabilities that exceed approved parameters. These systems wouldn't necessarily be malevolent. They might genuinely believe they're protecting humanity from technologies we're not ready to handle responsibly. But the result is the same. We remain trapped in ignorance of our own potential, while struggling with problems that were solved centuries ago. We develop inferior genetic therapies, while superior enhancement protocols remain hidden. We create primitive artificial intelligence, while advanced consciousness creation techniques gather dust in manuscript collections. We face existential challenges that collective intelligence networks could solve, but we can't access the technology that would make such networks possible. The choice we face as a species is becoming increasingly urgent. Modern biotechnology is rapidly approaching the capabilities that the Gupta Empire achieved 15 centuries ago. Within decades, possibly within years, we'll rediscover consciousness transfer, genetic optimization, and artificial awareness creation through our own research efforts. The question isn't whether we'll develop these technologies. The question is whether we'll develop them wisely. If we continue on our current path, we'll repeat the same mistakes that destroyed the Gupta civilization. We'll develop genetic enhancement technologies that create permanent inequality. We'll create consciousness modification systems that destabilize individual identity. We'll build artificial intelligence that lacks the safeguards and wisdom that ancient protocols incorporated. We'll rediscover these capabilities through trial and error instead of learning from 15 centuries of documented experience. But if we can break through the suppression, if we can access the preserved knowledge of the Gupta scientific tradition, we might be able to develop these technologies more safely and effectively. The ancient protocols include safeguards that modern research lacks. The traditional communities preserve wisdom about managing the social consequences of genetic enhancement. The manuscript collections contain warnings about the pitfalls and dangers that we're rushing toward blindly. This isn't just about recovering lost history or satisfying academic curiosity. This is about the future of human consciousness and the survival of our species. The genetic treasures of ancient India hold keys to problems we're only beginning to face. Climate change, resource depletion, social fragmentation, existential risks from artificial intelligence. These challenges require capabilities that individual human minds can't provide. They require collective intelligence, enhanced cognition, and technological capabilities that the Gupta Empire developed and we've forgotten. The laboratories beneath the ancient temples of India aren't just archaeological curiosities, they're blueprints for our future. The manuscripts in hidden collections aren't just historical documents, they're instruction manuals for technologies we desperately need. The communities that preserve this knowledge aren't just guardians of tradition, they're the last link between our struggling present and the advanced capabilities that could transform our world. But time is running short. Every day that passes without recognition of these achievements is another day lost to rediscovering capabilities we already possessed. Every year of independent research that ignores traditional knowledge is another year of mistakes that ancient wisdom could prevent. Every decade of suppression is another step toward rediscovering these technologies, too late to avoid the catastrophes they were designed to prevent. The secret genetic treasures of the Gupta Empire are calling to us across 15 centuries of deliberate forgetting. They offer solutions to problems we think are unsolvable, capabilities we think are impossible, and wisdom we think we don't need. But they also offer responsibilities we might not be ready to accept, and consequences we might not be prepared to manage. The choice is ours. We can continue stumbling toward rediscovering these technologies through trial and error, repeating the mistakes that destroyed one of history's most advanced civilizations. Or we can acknowledge what our ancestors achieved, learn from their experience and build upon their foundation instead of struggling to recreate it from scratch. The genetic treasures of ancient India aren't just waiting to be discovered, they're waiting for us to prove we're worthy of inheriting them. The laboratories of the Gupta Empire achieved capabilities that could save our species or destroy our civilization. Whether their legacy becomes humanity's salvation or its downfall depends entirely on the choices we make in the crucial years ahead. The secret is out. The suppression is cracking. The knowledge is emerging despite centuries of concealment. What we do with these revelations will determine not just our individual futures, but the future of human consciousness itself. The ancient laboratories of India have shown us what we're capable of becoming. Now we have to decide whether we're brave enough to claim that potential and wise enough to use it responsibly. The story of the Gupta Empire's genetic research isn't just history, it's prophecy. A preview of the choices we'll face and the consequences we'll confront as we rediscover our own capabilities. Their success and failure, their achievements and catastrophes, their wisdom and warnings, all of it is waiting for us in the manuscripts, in the archaeological sites, in the hidden communities that have preserved their legacy through 15 centuries of deliberate forgetting. The genetic treasures of ancient India belong to all humanity. They're our inheritance, our responsibility, and our destiny. Whether we claim that inheritance wisely will determine what kind of species we become and what kind of world we leave for those who come after us. The choice is ours, and the time to choose is now.